The Infinite Mind Atlas YouTube channel. The Salmon of Doubt by Douglas Adams. Prologue. Nicholas Rowe, in The Guardian. Saturday, June 3, 2000. In 1979, soon after The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was published, Douglas Adams was invited to sign copies at a small science fiction bookshop in Soho. As he drove there, some sort of demonstration slowed his progress. There was a traffic jam and crowds of people were everywhere, he recalls. It wasn't until he had pushed his way inside that Adams realized the crowds were there for him. Next day his publisher called to say he was #1 in the London Sunday Times bestseller list and his life changed forever. It was like being helicoptered to the top of Mount Everest, he says, or having an orgasm without the foreplay. Hitchhiker had already been a cult radio show, and was made in both television and stage versions. It expanded into 4 more books that sold over 14 million copies worldwide. There were records and computer games. And now, after 20 years of Hollywood prevarication, it is as close as it's ever been to becoming a movie. The story itself begins on Earth with mild-mannered suburbanite Arthur Dent trying to stop the local council demolishing his house to build a bypass. It moves into space when his friend, Ford Prefect, some have seen him as Virgil to Dent's Dante, reveals himself as a representative of a planet near Betelgeuse and informs Arthur that the Earth itself is about to be demolished to make way for a hyperspace express route. They hitch a ride on a Vogon spaceship and begin to use the Hitchhiker's Guide itself, a usually reliable repository of all knowledge about life, the universe, and everything. Adams's creativity and idiosyncratic intergalactic humor have had a pervasive cultural influence. The phrase Hitchhiker's Guide to quickly became common parlance, and there have been numerous copycat spoof sci-fi books and TV series. His Babel fish, a small fish you can place in your ear to translate any speech into your own language, has been adopted as the name of a translation device on an internet search engine. He followed up his success with several other novels as well as a television program and a book and CD-ROM on endangered species. He has founded a .com company, H2G2, that has recently taken the idea of the guide full circle by launching a service that promises real information on life, the universe, and everything via your mobile phone. Much of his wealth seems to have been spent fueling his passion for technology, but he has never really been the nerdy science fiction type. He is relaxed, gregarious, and a solidly built 2 meters tall. In fact, he has more the air of those English public school boys who became rock stars in the 1970s. He once did play guitar on stage at Earl's Court with his mates Pink Floyd. In a nicely flash touch, instead of producing a passport-size photo of his daughter out of his wallet, he opens up his impressively powerful laptop, where, after a bit of fiddling about, Polly Adams, aged 5, appears in a pop video spoof featuring a cameo appearance by another mate, John Cleese. So this is what his life turned into: money, A-list friends, and nice toys. Looking at the bare facts of his CV, boarding school, Cambridge footlights, and the BBC, it seems at first sight no surprise. But his has not been an entirely straightforward journey along well-worn establishment tracks. Douglas Noel Adams was born in Cambridge in 1952. One of his many stock gags is that he was DNA in Cambridge 9 months before Crick and Watson made their discovery. His mother, Janet, was a nurse at Addenbrooke's Hospital, and his father, Christopher, had been a teacher who went on to become a postgraduate theology student, a probation officer, and finally a management consultant, which was a very, very peculiar move, claims Adams. Anyone who knew my father will tell you that management was not something he knew very much about. The family were fairly hard up and left Cambridge 6 months after Douglas was born to live in various homes on the fringes of East London. When Adams was 5, his parents divorced. It's amazing the degree to which children treat their own lives as normal, he says. But of course it was difficult. My parents divorced when it wasn't remotely as common as it is now, and to be honest, I have scant memory of anything before I was 5. I don't think it was a great time, one way or another. After the breakup, Douglas and his younger sister went with their mother to Brentwood in Essex, where she ran a hostel for sick animals. He saw his by now comparatively wealthy father at weekends, and these visits became a source of confusion and tension. To add to the complications, several step-siblings emerged as his parents remarried. Adams has said that while he accepted all this as normal on one level, he did behave oddly as a result, and remembers himself as a twitchy and somewhat strange child. For a time, his teachers thought he was educationally subnormal, but by the time he went to the direct Grant Brentwood Prep School, he was regarded as extremely bright. The school boasts a remarkably diverse list of post-war alumni: clothing designer Hardy Amies, the disgraced historian David Irving, TV presenter Noel Edmonds, Home Secretary Jack Straw, and London Times editor Peter Stothard were all there before Adams, while comedians Griff Rhys-Jones and Keith Allen were a few years behind him. There are 4 alumni, 2 Labour and 2 Conservative, in the current House of Commons. In a scene that now seems rather incongruous in the light of Keith Allen's hard-living image, it was Adams who helped the 7-year-old Allen with his piano lessons. When Adams was 13, his mother remarried and moved to Dorset, and Adams changed from being a day boy at the school to a boarder. It appears to have been an entirely beneficial experience. Whenever I left school for in the afternoon, I always used to look at what the boarders were doing. Rather wistfully, he says. They seemed to be having a good time, and in fact, I thoroughly enjoyed boarding. There is a piece of me that likes to fondly imagine my maverick and rebellious nature. But more accurately, I like to have a nice and cozy institution that I can rub up against a little bit. There is nothing better than a few constraints you can comfortably kick against. Adams ascribes the quality of his education to being taught by some very good, committed, obsessed and charismatic people. At a recent party in London, he confronted Jack Straw on New Labour's apparent antipathy to direct grant schools, on the basis that it had done neither of them much harm. Frank Halford was a master at the school and remembers Adams as very tall even then, and popular. He wrote an end-of-term play when Doctor Who had just started on television. He called it Dr. Which. Many years later, Adams did write scripts for Doctor Who. He describes Halford as an inspirational teacher who is still a support. He once gave me 10 out of 10 for a story, which was the only time he did throughout his long school career. And even now, when I have a dark night of the soul as a writer and think that I can't do this anymore, the thing that I reach for is not the fact that I have had bestsellers or huge advances. It is the fact that Frank Halford once gave me 10 out of 10, and at some fundamental level I must be able to do it. It seems that from the beginning Adams had a facility for turning his writing into cash. He sold some short, almost haiku-length, stories to the Eagle Comic and received 10 shillings. You could practically buy a yacht for 10 shillings then, he laughs. But his real interest was music. He learned to play the guitar by copying note for note the intricate finger-picking patterns on an early Paul Simon album. He now has a huge collection of left-handed electric guitars, but admits that he's really a folkie at heart. Even with Pink Floyd on stage, I played a very simple guitar figure from Brain Damage, which was in a finger-picking style. Adams grew up in the 60s, and the Beatles planted a seed in my head that made it explode. Every 9 months there'd be a new album which would be an earth-shattering development from where they were before. We were so obsessed by them that when Penny Lane came out and we hadn't heard it on the radio, we beat up this boy who had heard it until he hummed the tune to us. People now ask if Oasis are as good as the Beatles. I don't think they are as good as the Rutless. The other key influence was Monty Python. Having listened to mainstream British radio comedy of the 50s, he describes it as an epiphanous moment, when he discovered that being funny could be a way in which intelligent people expressed themselves, and be very, very silly at the same time. The logical next step was to go to Cambridge University, because I wanted to join Footlights, he says. I wanted to be a writer-performer like the Pythons. In fact, I wanted to be John Cleese, and it took me some time to realize that the job was in fact taken. At university he quickly abandoned performing. I just wasn't reliable, and began to write self-confessed Python-esque sketches. He recalls one about a railway worker who was reprimanded for leaving all the switches open on the southern region to prove a point about existentialism, and another about the difficulties in staging the Crawley Paranoid Society annual general meeting. The arts administrator Mary Allen, formerly of the Arts Council and the Royal Opera, was a contemporary at Cambridge and has remained a friend ever since. She performed his material and remembers him as always noticed even amongst a very talented group of people. Douglas's material was very quirky and individualistic. You had to suit it, and it had to suit you. Even in short sketches he created a weird world. Adams says, I did have something of a guilt thing about reading English. I thought I should have done something useful and challenging. But while I was whinging, I also relished the chance not to do very much. Even his essays were full of jokes. If I had known then what I know now, I would have done biology or zoology. At the time I had no idea that was an interesting subject. But now I think it is the most interesting subject in the world. Other contemporaries included the lawyer and TV presenter Clive Anderson. The culture secretary Chris Smith was president of the Union. Adams used to do warm-up routines for debates, but not because of any political interest. I was just looking for anywhere I could do gags. It is very strange seeing these people dotted around the public landscape now. My contemporaries are starting to win Lifetime Achievement Awards, which obviously makes one feel nervous. After university, Adams got the chance to work with one of his heroes. Python member Graham Chapman had been impressed by some Footlights sketches and had made contact. When Adams went to see him, he was asked, much to his delight, to help out with a script Chapman had to finish that afternoon. We ended up working together for about a year. Mostly on a prospective TV series which never made it beyond the pilot. Chapman at this time was sucking down a couple of bottles of gin every day, which obviously gets in the way a bit. But Adams believes he was enormously talented. He was naturally part of a team and needed other people's discipline to enable his brilliance to work. His strength was flinging something into the mix that would turn it all upside down. After he split up with Chapman, Adams's career stalled badly. He continued to write sketches but was not making anything like a living. It turned out I wasn't terribly good at writing sketches. I could never write to order, and couldn't really do topical stuff. But occasionally I'd come out with something terrific from left field. Geoffrey Perkins, head of comedy at BBC Television, was the producer of the radio version of Hitchhiker. He remembers first coming across Adams when he directed a Footlights show. He was being heckled by a cast member, and then he fell into a chair. I next came across him when he was trying to write sketches for the radio show Weekending, then regarded as the big training ground for writers. Douglas was one of those writers who honorably failed to get anywhere with weekending. It put a premium on people who could write things that lasted 30 seconds, and Douglas was incapable of writing a single sentence that lasted less than 30 seconds. With his dreams of being a writer crumbling around him, Adams took a series of bizarre jobs, including working as a chicken shed cleaner and as a bodyguard to the ruling family of Qatar. I think the security firm must have been desperate. I got the job from an ad in the Evening Standard. Griff. Rhys Jones did the same job for a while on Adams's recommendation. Adams recalls becoming increasingly depressed as he endured night shifts of sitting outside hotel bedrooms. I kept thinking this wasn't how it was supposed to have worked out. At Christmas he went to visit his mother and stayed there for the next year. He recalls a lot of family worry about what he was going to do, and while he still sent in the occasional sketch to radio shows, he acknowledges that his confidence was extremely low. Despite his subsequent success and wealth, this propensity for a lack of confidence has continued. I have terrible periods of lack of confidence, he explains. I just don't believe I can do it. And no evidence to the contrary will sway me from that view. I briefly did therapy, but after a while I realized it is just like a farmer complaining about the weather. You can't fix the weather, you just have to get on with it. So, has that approach helped him? Not necessarily, he shrugs. Hitchhiker was the last throw of the dice, but in retrospect the timing was absolutely right. Star Wars had made science fiction voguish, and the aftermath of Monty Python meant that while a sketch show was out of the question, there was scope to appeal to the same comic sensibility. Python Terry Jones heard the tapes before transmission and remembers being struck by Adams's intellectual approach and strong conceptual ideas. You feel the stuff he is writing has come from a criticism of life, as Matthew Arnold might say. It has a moral basis and a critical basis that has a strong mind behind it. For instance, John Cleese has a powerful mind, but he is more logical and analytical. Douglas is more quirky and analytical. Jeffrey Perkins agrees, but remembers there was little grand plan behind the project. Douglas went into it with a whole load of ideas but very little notion of what the story would be. He was writing it in an almost Dickensian mode of episodic weekly installments without quite knowing how it would end. By the time the series aired in 1978, Adams says, he had put about 9 months solid work into it and had been paid £1,000. There seemed to be quite a long way to go before I broke even, so he accepted a producer's job at the BBC but quit 6 months later when he found himself simultaneously writing a second radio series, the novel, the television series, and episodes of Doctor Who. Despite this remarkable workload, he was already building a legendary reputation for not writing. I love deadlines, he has said. I love the whooshing noise they make as they go by. Success only added to his ability to prevaricate. His publishing editor, Sue Freestone, quickly realized that he treated writing as performance art, and so she set up her office in his dining room. He needs an instant audience to bounce things off, but sometimes this can weirdly backfire. There was a scene early in one book when he talked about some plates with, very definitely, 1 banana on each. This was obviously significant, so I asked him to explain. But he liked to tease his audience and he said he'd tell me later. We eventually got to the end of the book and I asked him again. Okay, Douglas, what's with the bananas? He looked at me completely blankly. He had forgotten all about the bananas. I still occasionally ask him if he has remembered yet, but apparently he hasn't. Writer and producer John Lloyd has been a friend and collaborator with Adams since before Hitchhiker. He remembers the agonies of indecision and panic Adams got into when writing. We were on holiday in Corfu with 3 friends when he was finishing a book, and he ended up taking over the whole house. He had a room to write in, a room to sleep in, a room to go to when he couldn't sleep, and so on. It didn't occur to him that other people might want a good night's sleep as well. He goes through life with a brain the size of a planet, and often seems to be living on a different one. He is absolutely not a malicious person, but when he is in the throes of panic and terror and unable to finish a book, everything else pales into insignificance. However the work was dragged out, it was extremely popular. The books all became bestsellers, and Adams was given an advance of over $2 million by his American publishers. He wrote a hilarious spoof dictionary with John Lloyd, The Meaning of Life, in which easily recognized concepts, such as the feeling you get at 4 in the afternoon when you haven't got enough done, were given the names of towns, Farnham being the perfect choice for this. Low-grade depression. In the late 80s he completed 2 spoof detective novels featuring Dirk Gently. For all his facility with humor, Freestone says she has been touched by how profoundly Adams's work has connected with some readers. In Hitchhiker, all you have to do to be safe is have your towel with you, she explains. I heard about this woman who was dying in a hospice who felt she would be fine because she had her towel with her. She had taken Douglas's universe and incorporated it into her own. It embarrassed the hell out of Douglas when he heard about it. But for her it was literally a symbol of safety when embarking on an unknown journey. There are serious themes within his work. The second Dirk Gently novel can easily be read as being about people who are homeless, displaced, and alienated from society. His imagination goes much deeper than just cleverness, says Freestone. The social criticism is usually buried by the comedy, but it's there if you want to find it. Having been through such a lean period, Adams worked constantly until the mid-90s, when he very deliberately applied the brakes. I had got absolutely stuck in the middle of a novel, and although it sounds ungrateful, having to do huge book signings would drive me to angry depressions. He says that he still thought of himself as a scriptwriter and only inadvertently found himself as a novelist. It sounds absurd, but a bit of me felt cheated, and it also felt as if I had cheated. And then there is the money cycle. You're paid a lot and you're not happy, so the first thing you do is buy stuff that you don't want or need, for which you need more money. His financial affairs got into a mess in the 1980s, he says. He won't discuss the details, but says that the knock-on effect was considerable, so that everyone assumed he was wealthier than he actually was. It is possible to track the movement of Adams's life even between the first and second series of the radio show. In the first there were a lot of jokes about pubs and being without any money. The second had more jokes about expensive restaurants and accountants. I felt like a mouse in a wheel, he says. There was no pleasure coming into the cycle at any point. When you write your first book age 25 or so, you have 25 years of experience, albeit much of it juvenile experience. The second book comes after an extra year sitting in bookshops. Pretty soon you begin to run on empty. His response to running out of fuel was to attempt some creative crop rotation. In particular, his interest in technology took off, as did a burgeoning passion for environmental issues. In 1990 he wrote Last Chance to See. As is the way of these things, it was my least successful book, but is still the thing I am most proud of. The book began when he was sent to Madagascar by a magazine to find a rare type of lemur. He thought this would be quite interesting, but it turned into a complete revelation. His fascination with ecology led to an interest in evolution. I'd been given a thread to pull, and following that lead began to open up issues to me that became the object of the greatest fascination. A link at the bottom of his emails now directs people to the Dien Fossey Trust, which works to protect gorillas and save the rhino. Adams was also a signatory to the Great Ape Project, which argued for a change of moral status for great apes, recognizing their rights to life, liberty, and freedom from torture. He was a founding member of the team that launched Comic Relief, but he has never been a hairshirt sort of activist. The parties he held at his Islington home would feature music by various legendary rock stars. Gary Brooker of Procol Harum once sang the whole of A Whiter Shade of Pale, including all the abandoned verses, and were peopled by media aristocracy and high-tech billionaires. Slightly less orthodoxly, for an enthusiastic, almost evangelical atheist, he would also host carol services every Christmas. As a child, I was an active Christian. I used to love the school choir and remember the carol service as always such an emotional thing. He adds Bach to the Beatles and the Pythons in his pantheon of influences, but how does this square with his passionate atheism? Life is full of things that move or affect you in one way or another, he explains. The fact that I think Bach was mistaken doesn't alter the fact that I think the B minor Mass is one of the great pinnacles of human achievement. It still absolutely moves me to tears to hear it. I find the whole business of religion profoundly interesting. But it does mystify me that otherwise intelligent people take it seriously. This attachment to traditional structures, if not traditional beliefs, is carried over in the fact that his daughter, Polly, who was born in 1994, has 4 non-godparents. Mary Allen is one of them, and it was she who introduced Adams to his wife, the barrister Jane Belson. Allen says, in the early 80s Douglas was going through some writing crisis and was ringing me every day. I eventually asked him whether he was lonely. It seemed that he was, so we decided he needed someone to share his huge flat. Jane moved in. After several false starts, they married in 1991 and lived in Islington until last year, when the family moved to Santa Barbara. Adams says the initial move was harder than he expected. I've only recently understood how opposed to the move my wife was. He now says he would recommend it to anyone in the depths of middle age just upping sticks and going somewhere else. You reinvent your life and start again. It is invigorating. His role in his .com business fits into this sense of invigoration. His job title is chief fantasist. I've never thought of myself in the role of a predictive science fiction writer. I was never an Arthur C. Clarke wannabe. The guide was a narrative device for absorbing all those ideas that spark off the flywheel, but it has turned out to be a very good idea. But it's early days. He warns. We're still in a swimming pool and there's an ocean out there. Other new ventures are a novel, 8 years late and counting, talk of a Dirk Gently film, the H2G2 website and an e-novel. I've been talking about how electronic books will come, and how important they will be, and all of a sudden Stephen King publishes one. I feel a complete idiot, as it should have been me. The film project has been 20 years of constipation, and he likens the Hollywood process to trying to grill a steak by having a succession of people coming into the room and breathing on it. He is surprisingly enthusiastic about this apparently antique art form. With new, more immature technologies, there is a danger in getting excited about all the ways you can push them forward at the expense of what you want to say. It is therefore rewarding to work in a medium where you don't have to solve those problems because it is a mature medium. After such a long fallow period, he wisely notes that many of these new projects and ideas will fall by the wayside. But I've been out of the mainstream of novel writing for several years, and I really needed to take that break. I've been thinking hard and thinking creatively about a whole load of stuff that is not novel writing. As opposed to running on empty, it now feels like the tank is full again. Chapter 1. Early most mornings Dave climbed up to this isolated spot on the hill and brought small offerings to leave in the shrine of St. Clive, the patron saint of real estate agents. Today what he'd brought was, so far as he could make out, part of a swimming pool cleaning device, a sort of large, plastic, sucking lobsterish thing. He laid the thing down carefully and stood back to admire the effect. The shrine was just a small heap of rocks, really, with a little array of things that had got dug up from time to time. There was a remote control garage opener, something that was probably part of a juice extractor, and a small, illuminated Kermit the Frog. The pool cleaning lobsterish thing was a pretty good addition, and he arranged it so that its 2 feet of broken ribbed plastic tubing hung down like an elephant's trunk over Kermit. His morning trips up to the shrine were partly just to amuse himself, but also a chance to be alone and reflect on things. This whole place had started just as somewhere to fool around by himself, but it had rapidly turned into something kind of bigger than he meant, and he needed somewhere to get away from it all and think about things. Sometimes he'd even worry. When he was worried he would start to giggle slightly, and when he was really worried he would start to hum old Carpenter's tunes till the worry went away. But today he wasn't going to worry. Today he was going to have fun. He unslung the canvas bag he'd brought up with him and dropped it on the ground for a moment. From up here, the view was stupendous. Lush forest surrounded Daveland. In every direction, forest of extraordinary richness and diversity, teeming with life and color. Through it wound the river Dave, which then meandered on through the hills till it met, 500 miles away, the immense ocean, which, until recently, he had called the Dave Ocean, but which in a fit of modest embarrassment he had now renamed the Karen Ocean. He had always thought that Pacific was a really dumb name. He had been on it. It wasn't Pacific at all. He'd fixed that. Daveland itself was now a pretty impressive affair. Astonishing, really. When he thought about it. He brushed his hand through his lank hair and stared out at it, suppressing a very, very small giggle. Daveland lightly covered about 90 acres of hillside, with new outcrops already beginning to appear on nearby hills. Beautiful homes. Much more beautiful than any of the ones that his imaginary St. Clive would have sold or even understood. None of your split-level ranch-style crap with stupid conversation pits that anyone with half a brain would probably kill themselves rather than Converse, Indiana. Dave's houses were of a different kind. Altogether. Apart from anything else, they were smart houses. Just simple stuff, like they faced the right way. They had glass in the right places, stone in the right places, water in the right places, plants in the right places, so the air moved through them properly and was warm where you wanted it and cool where you wanted it. It was just physics. Most architects didn't know any physics. He decided. They just knew dumb stuff. In Dave's houses, prisms and fibers moved sunlight where you wanted it. Heat exchangers took heat from the food in the fridge and gave it to the food in the oven. Simple. People went into Dave's houses and would say, "Hey, this is really neat. How come other people don't build houses like this?" Answer: because they're dumb. And telephones. Dave had given people here much neater, smarter, altogether more fabulous telephones than they'd ever had before. Now they wanted television as well, which Dave thought was pretty dumb in the first place, and monumentally dumb in the circumstances, but that in turn had been A pretty interesting problem, and Dave, of course, had solved it. But Dave had solved so many problems that he had inadvertently created a new one. Daveland was now a community of nearly 1,000 people, which made him kind of responsible. He hadn't expected to be responsible. He pulled up a bunch of long grass and swished it around fretfully. The early morning sunlight glinted off Dave's place. Dave's place was easily the largest and most gracious of all the buildings in the world. It ringed. The summit of the hill opposite, with elegant sweeping white stone walls and seeming acres of glass. The summit itself was laid out as a Japanese garden. Streams ran down through the house from it. Just beneath Dave's place, on the same hillside and contained within the same security compound, he couldn't believe he had to have stuff like security compounds now, and 40 of the 900 plus inhabitants of Daveland were now lawyers, was the way of the nostril. The way of the nostril was probably the single smartest thing that Dave had ever thought of. Even he, to whom most things that most people would think were pretty smart were pretty dumb, thought it was pretty smart. It was the single reason that all of this was here, and it had become the single thing that made Dave hum old carpenters' tunes most, except maybe the lawyers. The sun was now gleaming brilliantly over all of Daveland. It was pretty neat, Dave had to admit, but he also had to admit that he had kind of liked Daveland when it was just his own funny stupid place to come to, because only he was smart enough to get there. But one thing had led to another, and now all this. Here he was, only 25 and already beginning to feel like he was almost 30. Well, screw all that. Today he was going to have some fun. He picked up the large canvas bag and slung it back over his shoulders. Sam would have a fit. The lawyers would go nuts. Good. He turned and climbed farther on up the hill. The hill was called Top of the World, and was named after the tune by the Carpenters. One of the great things about having your own world was that you could just go ahead and like the Carpenters on it. The hill got pretty rocky and craggy higher up, and Dave had to do a bit of rock scrambling to get to where he was going. Within about 20 minutes he was pretty hot and a bit sweaty, but he'd made it to the top, or at least the last significant flat bit, a solid slab of deeply rutted rock on which he sat, and dumped the bag. He gathered his breath for a few moments and then started to unpack it. He pulled out aluminium struts, he pulled out orange strings, he pulled out little purple sheets of Kevlar. After about 10 minutes of assembly the thing was ready, a large gossamer winged insect of a contraption. The scraps of Kevlar strung between the struts of the frame were surprisingly small and oddly shaped. Dave had worked out that most of the cloth used in conventional hang gliders was redundant, and had got rid of it. He examined the assembled frame systematically and satisfied himself that it was all as it should be, that it was Dave worthy. He looked out nervously, but only just for a moment. He was going to do it anyway, so it was dumb to be nervous. Carefully picking up the hang glider, he carried it out to the edge of the rock, till he was standing on a ledge, looking out over the whole extent of Daveland. He noticed with satisfaction that although his glider looked like nothing more than a kind of drying frame for silk bikinis, it was very stiff and he had to pull it forcefully through the air to move it. From here to Dave's place was about a mile horizontally and a couple of 100 feet vertically. He could just see, glinting in the sun, his large blue swimming pool, neatly secluded within the Japanese garden on the top of Dave's hill. The distance and the direction of the sun made details a little difficult, but he was confident that Sam would be waiting for him there, beside the pool. He reckoned he could drop himself pretty neatly into that. He glanced at his watch. It was just after 8 o'clock, and he'd scheduled the meeting for 8. Sam would be there. Sam's view was that a lot of Dave's plans and schemes were reckless. Crazy, irresponsible, occasionally bordering on the just plain dumb. Dropping into the pool would be something better than dumb guys could do. How tough could it be to do it if you were Dave? He checked the wind direction, stepped into a lightweight harness belt. Tightened it, clipped the belt to the glider, passed his hands through 2 loops, gripped the main struts, and he was ready. All he had to do now was throw himself off into space. Wow. Okay. Go. No fuss, no dumb stuff. With a light heart he threw himself out forward. And sailed into empty space. The air supported him immediately, with a little rough buffeting. He braced himself against the frame, then tried to relax a little, then relaxed a little more, trying to find a good balance that was easy. But responsive. He got it. He was out there. He was flying. He was just some kind of a bird. Hey, this was good. The empty air was kind of a shock, but a good shock. Like a swimming pool in the morning. And the air wasn't empty. It was like falling into enormous invisible pillows, with fingers that came out and tugged. And pulled at you, ruffling your hair, rattling your t-shirt. As his brain got to grips with the huge openness around him, he felt like a little toy hanging from the end of an immense mobile slowly turning over Dave World. He was turning in a big, easy arc, a little bit to the right and then, in response to a small shift in his weight, a little bit to the left, but still, it seemed, moving as an arc within an arc, a wheel within a wheel. The world, his world, turned slowly around beneath him, green, rich, lush and vivid. It was about 1.2 million years since the human race had suddenly gone extinct, and the world had really perked up a lot in that time. In geological terms it was but a fleeting moment, of course, but the forces of evolution had suddenly had tons of space to play in, huge gaps to fill, and everything had started to thrive like crazy. Everybody used to talk about saving the world. Well, Dave had done it. Now it was great. The whole place was really neat. Now, Dave World. Yay. He was riding the air pretty well now, not fighting it, but flowing along it. He was beginning to get a sense, though, that just dropping himself in his own swimming pool might be a little tougher than he had expected. But that was how he liked things to be, a little tougher than he expected. Maybe it was even going to be a lot tougher, he began to realize. It was one thing to be staying comfortably aloft, following the currents, riding gradually down, it was quite another thing to steer in any meaningful kind of way. When he tried to turn too sharply, the delicate structure around him would start to rattle and bang in quite an alarming way. Chapter 2. I don't do cats, said Dirk gently. His tone was sharp. He felt he had come up in the world. He had no evidence to support this view, he just felt it was about time. He also had indigestion, but that had nothing whatever to do with it. The woman, what was her name? Melinda something. He had it written on a piece of paper somewhere but had lost it, possibly under the pile of unopened bank statements on the far corner of his desk, was standing in front of his desk with her left eyebrow raised indignantly. Your advertisement says. The advertisement is out of date, snapped Dirk. I don't do cats. He waved her away and pretended to be busy with some paperwork. Then what do you do? She persisted. Dirk looked up curtly. He had taken against this woman as soon as she walked in. Not only had she caught him completely off guard, but she was also irritatingly beautiful. He didn't like beautiful women. They upset him. With their grace, their charm, their utter loveliness, and their complete refusal to go out to dinner with him. He could tell, the very instant this Melinda woman walked into the room, that she wouldn't go out to dinner with him if He was the last man on Earth and had a pink Cadillac convertible, so he decided to take preemptive action. If she was going to not go out to dinner with him, then she would not go out to dinner with him on his terms. None of your business, he snapped. His gut gurgled painfully. She raised her other eyebrow as well. Has the appointment I made with you caught you at a bad time? Yes, thought Dirk, though he didn't say it. It was one of the worst months he could remember. Business had been slow, but not merely slow. What was? Normally a trickle had first slowed to a dribble and then dried up completely. Nothing. Nobody. No work whatever, unless you included the batty old woman who had come in with a dog whose name she couldn't remember. She had suffered, she said, a minor blow to the head and had forgotten her dog's name, as a result of which he would not come when she called. Please could he find out what his name was? Normally she would ask her husband, she explained, only he had recently died bungee jumping, which he shouldn't have been doing at his age, only it was his 70th birthday and he said he'd do exactly what he wanted even if it killed him, which of course it did, and though she had of course tried contacting him through a medium, the only message she'd got from him was that he didn't believe in all this stupid spiritualist nonsense, it was all a damned fraud, which she thought was very rude of him, and certainly rather embarrassing for the medium. And so on. He had taken the job. This was what it had come to. He didn't say any of this, of course. He just gave the Melinda woman a cold look and said, "This is a respectable private investigation business." Respectable, she said, or respected? What do you mean? Dirk usually produced much sharper retorts than this, but, as the woman said, she had caught him at a bad time. After a weekend dominated by the struggle to identify a dog, nothing at all had happened yesterday, except for one thing that had given him a very nasty turn and made him wonder if he was going mad. Big difference, the Melinda woman continued. Like the difference between something that's supposedly inflatable and something that's actually inflated. Between something that's supposedly unbreakable and something that will actually survive a good fling at the wall. What? Said Dirk. I mean that however respectable your business may be, if it was actually respected, you'd probably be able to afford a carpet, some paint on the walls, and maybe even another chair in here for a person to sit on. Dirk had no idea what had happened to the other chair in his office, but he certainly wasn't going to admit it. You don't need a chair, he said. I'm afraid you are here under a misapprehension. We have nothing to discuss. Good day to you, dear lady. I am not going to look for your lost cat. I didn't say it was a lost cat. I beg your pardon, said Dirk. You distinctly. I said it was a sort of lost cat. It's half lost. Dirk looked at her expressionlessly. Apart from being extremely good-looking in a blondish, willowy-ish kind of way, she was dressed well in an I don't care what I wear, just any old thing that's lying around kind of way. That relies on being extremely careful about what you leave lying around. She was obviously pretty bright, probably had a pretty good job, like running some sort of major textile or telecommunications company, despite being clearly only 32. In other words, she was exactly the sort of person who didn't mislay cats, and certainly didn't go running off to pokey little private detective agencies if she did. He felt ill at ease. Talk sense, please, he said sharply. My time is valuable. Oh yes? How valuable? She looked scornfully around his office. He had to admit to himself that it was grim, but he was damned if he was just going to sit there and take it. Just because he needed the work, needed the money, had nothing better to do with his time. There was no reason for anybody to think that he was at the beck and call of every good-looking woman who walked into his office offering to pay for his services. He felt humiliated. I'm not talking about my scale of fees, though it is, I promise you. Awesome. I was merely thinking of time passing. Time that won't pass this way again. He leaned forward in a pointed manner. Time is a finite entity, you know. Only about 4 billion years to go till the sun explodes. I know it seems like a lot now, but it will soon go if we just squander it on frivolous nonsense and small talk. Small talk. This is half of my cat we're talking about. Madam, I don't know who this we is that you are referring to, but listen. You may choose, when you've heard the details of this case, not to accept it because it is, I admit, a little odd. But I made an appointment to see you on the basis of what it said in your advertisement, to wit, that you find lost cats, and if you turn me down solely on the basis that you do not find lost cats, then I must remind you that there is such a thing as the Trades Descriptions Act. I can't remember exactly what it says, but I bet you £5 it says you can't do that. Dirk sighed. He picked up a pencil and pulled a pad of paper towards him. All right, he said, I'll take down the details of the case. Thank you. And then I'll turn it down. That's your business. The point I'm trying to make, said Dirk, is that it isn't. So, what is this cat's name? Gusty. Gusty. Yes. Short for Gusty Wins. Dirk looked at her. I won't ask, he said. You'll wish you had. I'll be the judge of that. She shrugged. Male, said Dirk. Female? Male. Age? 4 years. Description? Well, that's a bit tricky. How hard can a question be? What is he, black? White? Ginger? Tabby? Oh. Siamese. Good, said Dirk, writing down Siamese. And when did you last see him? About 3 minutes ago. Dirk laid his pencil down and looked at her. Maybe 4, in fact, she added. Let me see if I understand you, said Dirk. You say you lost your cat, Gusty, while you've been standing here talking to me? No. I lost him, or sort of half lost him, 2 weeks ago. But I last saw him, which is what you asked, just before I came into your office. I just checked to see he was okay. Which he was. Well, sort of okay. If you can call it okay. And, where was he, exactly, when you checked to see that he was okay? In his basket. Shall I bring him in? He's just out here. She went out of the room and returned with a medium-sized wickerwork cat box. She put it down on Dirk's desk. Its contents mewed slightly. She closed the door behind her. Dirk frowned. Excuse me if I'm being a little obtuse, he said, looking round the basket at her. Tell me which bit of this I've got wrong. It seems to me that you are asking me if I will exercise my professional skills to search for and if possible find and return to you a cat. Yes. Which you already have with you in a cat basket. Well, that's right up to a point. And which point is that? Have a look for yourself. She slid out the metal rod that held the lid in place, reached into the basket, lifted out the cat, and put him down on Dirk's desk, next to the basket. Dirk looked at him. Gusty, looked at him. There's a particular disdain with which Siamese cats regard you. Anyone who has accidentally walked in on the queen cleaning her teeth will be familiar with this feeling. Gusty looked at Dirk and clearly found him reprehensible in some way. He turned away, yawned, stretched, groomed his whiskers briefly, licked down a small patch of ruffled fur, then leapt lightly off the table and started carefully to examine a splinter of floorboard, which he found to be far more interesting than Dirk. Dirk stared wordlessly at Gusty. Up to a point, Gusty looked exactly like a normal Siamese cat. Up to a point. The point up to which Gusty looked like a normal Siamese cat was his waist, which was marked by a narrow, cloudy gray band. "The front half looks quite well," said Melinda, whatever her name was, in a small voice. "Quite sleek and healthy, really." "And the back half," said Dirk, "is what I want you to look for." Beyond the gray, cloudy band there was nothing. The cat's body simply stopped dead in midair. Everything below approximately the 9th rib was, well, absent. The odd thing about this was that the cat seemed quite unaffected. This is not to suggest that he had learnt to live with his sad affliction, or that he was courageously making the best of things. He was, quite simply, unaffected. He didn't seem to notice. Not content with ignoring the normal requirements of biology, the cat was also in clear breach of the laws of physics. He moved, jumped, promenade, sat, in exactly the same way as if his rear half were present. "It isn't invisible," said Melinda, picking the cat up, awkwardly. "It's actually not there." She passed her hand back and forth through clear air. "Where the cat's hindquarters should have been." The cat twisted and turned in her grip, mewling crossly, then leapt nimbly to the ground and stalked about in an affronted manner. My, said Dirk, steepling his fingers under his chin. "That is odd. You'll take the case?" "No," said Dirk. He pushed the pad of paper away from him. "I'm sorry, but I just can't be doing this sort of stuff. If there's anything I want less than to find a cat, it's to find half a cat. Suppose I was unfortunate enough to find it. What then? How am I supposed to go about sticking it on? I'm sorry, but I'm through with cats, and I am definitely through with anything that even smacks of the supernatural or paranormal. I'm a rational being, and excuse me." The phone was ringing. Dirk answered it. He sighed. It was Thor, the ancient Norse god of thunder. Dirk knew immediately it was him from the long, portentous silence and the low grumblings of irritation followed by strange, distant bawling noises. Thor did not understand phones very well. He would usually stand 10 feet away and shout godlike commands at them. This worked surprisingly well as far as making the connection was concerned, but made actual conversation well nigh impossible. Thor had moved in with an American girl of Dirk's acquaintance, and Dirk understood from the strange Icelandic proclamations echoing over the line that he, Dirk, was supposed to be turning up for tea that afternoon. Dirk said that, yes, he knew that he would be there at about 5, was looking forward to it and would see him later, but Thor, of course, could hear none of this from where he was standing, and was beginning to get angry and shout a lot. Dirk had at last to give up and hesitantly put the phone down, hoping that Thor would not do too much damage in Kate's small flat. She had, he knew, managed to persuade the big god to try to crush packets of crisps in his rages, rather than actual sofas and motorbikes, but it was sometimes touch and go when he really couldn't get the hang of what was going on. Dirk felt oppressed. He looked up. "Oh yes. No," he said. "Go away. I can't deal with any more of this stuff. But, Mr. Gently, I hear you have something of a reputation in this area. And that's precisely what I want to get rid of. So please get out of here. And take your bifurcated feline with you." "Well, if that's your attitude." She picked up the cat basket and sauntered out. The half-cat made a pretty good go of sauntering out as well. Dirk sat in his desk and simmered for a minute or two, wondering why he was so out of sorts today. Looking out of his window, he saw the extremely attractive and intriguing client he had just rudely turned away out of sheer grumpiness. She looked particularly gorgeous and alluring as she hurried across the road toward a black London taxicab. He hurried to the window and wrenched it up. He leaned out. "I suppose dinner's out of the question, then," he yelled. Chapter 3. "You just missed Thor, I'm afraid," said Kate Schechter. He suddenly went off in a fit of Nordic angst about something or other. She waved a hand vaguely at the gaping, jagged hole in the window that overlooked Primrose Hill. "Probably gone to the zoo to stare at elks again. He'll turn up again in a few hours, full of beer and remorse and carrying a large pane of glass that won't fit. So he'll then get upset about that and break something else. We had a bit of a misunderstanding on the phone, I'm afraid," said Dirk. "But I don't really know how to avoid them." "You can't," said Kate. "He's not a happy god. It's not his world. Never will be either. So what are you going to do?" "Oh, there's plenty to do. Just repairing things keeps me busy." It wasn't what Dirk meant, but he realized she knew that and didn't probe. She went into the kitchen to fetch the tea at that point anyway. He subsided into an elderly armchair and peered around the small flat. He noticed that there was now quite a collection of books on Norse mythology stacked on Kate's desk, all sprouting numerous bookmarks and annotated record cards. She was obviously doing her best to master the situation. But one book, buried about 4 inches into the wall and obviously flung there by superhuman force, gave some idea of the sort of difficulties she was up against. "Don't even ask," she said, when she returned bearing tea. "Tell me what's going on with you instead." "I did something this afternoon," he said, stirring the pale, sickly tea and suddenly remembering that, of course, Americans had no idea how to make it. "That was incredibly stupid. I thought you seemed a bit grim." "Probably the cause rather than the effect. I'd had an appalling week, plus I had indigestion, and I suppose it made me a bit." "Don't tell me. You met a very attractive and desirable woman and were incredibly pompous and rude to her." Dirk stared at her. "How did you know that?" he breathed. "You do it all the time." "You did it to me." "I did not," protested Dirk. "You certainly did." "No, no, no. I promise you, you." "Hang on," interrupted Dirk. "I remember now." Interesting. And you're saying I do that all the time?" "Maybe not all the time. Presumably you have to get some sleep." "Occasionally. But you claim that, typically, I'm rude and pompous to attractive women?" He wrestled his way up out of the armchair and fished around in his pocket for a notebook. "I didn't mean you to get quite so serious about it. It's not exactly a major, well, now I come to think about it, I suppose it probably is a major character flaw." "What are you doing?" "Oh, just making a note. Odd thing about being a private detective, you spend your time finding out little things about other people that nobody else knows, but then you discover that there are all sorts of things that everybody else knows about you, which you don't. For instance, did you know that I walk in an odd way? A kind of strutting waddle, someone described it as." "Yes, of course I do. Everybody who knows you knows that." "Except me, you see," said Dirk. "Now that I know, I've been trying to catch myself at it as I walk past shop windows. Doesn't work, of course. All I ever see is myself frozen mid-stride with one foot in the air and gaping like a fish. Anyway, I'm drawing up a little list, to which I have now added, am always extremely rude and pompous to attractive women." Dirk stood and looked at the note for a second or two. "You know," he said, thoughtfully, "that could explain an astonishing number of things." "Oh come on," said Kate. "You're taking this a bit literally." "I just meant, I've noticed that when you're not feeling good, or you're on the spot in some way, you tend to get defensive, and that's when are you writing all this down as well?" "Of course. It's all useful stuff. I might end up mounting a full-scale investigation into myself. Damn all else to do at the moment. No work? No, said Dirk, gloomily. Kate tried to give him a shrewd look, but he was staring out of the window. And is the fact that you don't have any work connected in any way to the fact that you were very rude to an attractive woman? Just barging in like that, muttered Dirk, half to himself. Don't tell me, said Kate. She wanted you to look for a lost cat. Oh no, said Dirk. Not even as grand as that. Gone are the days when I used to have entire cats to look for. What do you mean? Dirk described the cat. See what I have to contend with, he added. Kate stared at him. You're not serious. I am, he said. Half a cat? Yes. Just the back half. I thought you said the front half. No, she'd got that. That was there, all right. She only wanted me to look for the back half. He stared thoughtfully at London from over the raised rim of his china teacup. Kate looked at him suspiciously. But isn't that, she said, very, very, very weird? Dirk turned and faced her. I would say, he declared, that it was the single most weird and extraordinary phenomenon I have witnessed in a lifetime of witnessing weird and extraordinary phenomena. Unfortunately, he added, turning away again. I wasn't in the mood for it. What do you mean? I had indigestion. I'm always bad-tempered when I've got indigestion. And just because of that, it was more than that. I'd lost the piece of paper too. What piece of paper? That I wrote down her appointment on. Turned up under a pile of bank statements, which you never open or look at. Dirk frowned, and opened his notebook again. Never open bank statements, he wrote thoughtfully. So, when she arrived, he continued, after he'd put the book back in his pocket. I wasn't expecting her, so I wasn't in command of the situation. Which meant that he fished out his notebook and wrote in it again. Now what are you putting? Asked Kate. Control freak, said Dirk. My first instinct was to make her sit down. And then pretend to get on with something while I composed myself. So? I looked around and I noticed there wasn't a chair. God knows where it had gone. Which meant that she had to stand over me. Which I also hate. That's when I turned really ratty. He peered at his notebook again, and flipped through it. Strange convergence of tiny little events, don't you think? What do you mean? Well, here was a case of the most extraordinary kind. A beautiful, intelligent, and obviously well-off woman arrives and offers to pay me to investigate a phenomenon that challenges the very foundation of everything that we know about physics and biology, and I turn it down. Astonishing. Normally you'd have to nail me to the floor to keep me away from a case like that. Unless, he added thoughtfully, waving his notebook slowly in the air. Unless you knew me this well. What are you suggesting? Well, I don't know. The whole sequence of little obstacles would have been completely invisible except for one thing. When I eventually found the piece of paper I'd written her details on, the phone number was missing. The bottom of the sheet of paper had been torn off. So I have no easy way of finding her. Well, you could try calling directory information. What's her name? Smith. Hopeless. But don't you think it odd that the number had been torn off? No, not really, if you want an honest answer. People tear off scraps of paper all the time. I can see you're probably in a mood to construct some massive space/time bending conspiracy theory out of it, but I suspect you just tore off a strip of paper to clean your ears out with. You'd worry about space/time if you'd seen that cat. Maybe you just need to get your contact lenses cleaned. I don't wear contact lenses. Maybe it's time you did. Dirk sighed. I suppose there are times when my imaginings do get a little overwrought, he said. I've just had too little to do recently. Business has been so slow, I've even been reduced to looking up to see if they'd got my number right in the yellow pages and then calling it myself just to check that it was working. Kate. Yes, Dirk. You would tell me if you thought I was going mad or anything, wouldn't you? That's what friends are for. Are they? Mused Dirk. Are they? You know, I've often wondered. The reason I ask is that when I phone myself up. Yes? I answered. Dirk, old friend, said Kate, you need a rest. I've had nothing but rest, grumbled Dirk. In which case you need something to do. Yes, said Dirk. But what? Kate sighed. I can't tell you what to do, Dirk. No one can ever tell you anything. You never believe anything unless you've worked it out for yourself. Said Dirk, opening his notebook again. Now that is an interesting one. Chapter 4. Josh, said a voice in a kind of Swedish-Irish accent. Dirk ignored it. He unloaded his small bag of shopping into bits of his badly disfigured kitchen. It was mostly frozen pizza, so it mostly went into his small freezer cabinet, which was mostly filled with old, white, clenched things that he was now too frightened to try to identify. Jude, said the Swedish-Irish voice. Don't make it bad, hummed Dirk to himself. He turned on the radio for the 6 o'clock news. It featured mostly gloomy stuff. Pollution, disaster, civil war, famine, etc., and, just as an added bonus, speculation as to whether the Earth was going to be hit by a giant comet or not. Julian, said the Swedish-Irish voice, tinnily. Dirk shook his head. Surely not. More on the comet story, there was a wide range of views about precisely what was going to happen. Some authorities said that it was going to hit Sheridan, Wyoming, on the 17th of June. NASA scientists said that it would burn up in the upper atmosphere and not reach the surface. A team of Indian astronomers said that it would miss the Earth altogether by several million miles before going on to plunge into the sun. The British authorities said it would do whatever the Americans said it would do. Julio, said the voice. No response. Dirk missed the next thing the radio said because of the noise of his front wall flapping. His front wall was made of large, thick sheets of polythene. These days, because of an incident a few weeks earlier when, in a radical departure from the sort of behavior that Dirk's neighbors liked to see, a tornado jet fighter had exploded out of the front of Dirk's house and then plunged screaming into Finsbury. There was, of course, a perfectly logical explanation for this, and Dirk was tired of giving it. The reason that Dirk had had a tornado jet fighter in his hallway was that he hadn't known it was a tornado jet fighter. Of course, he hadn't known it was a tornado jet fighter. As far as he was concerned, it was merely a large and bad-tempered eagle that he had trapped in his hallway the same way anybody would to stop it dive-bombing him the whole time. That a large tornado jet fighter had, for a brief while, taken on the shape of an eagle was on account of an unfortunate airborne encounter with the thunder god, Thor, of legend, and this was the part of the story where Dirk usually had to struggle a little to sustain his audience's patient attention, which he would, if successful, further strain by explaining that the thunder god, Thor, had then thought better of his fit of temper and decided to put things right by returning the tornado to its proper shape. Unfortunately, Thor, being a god, had had his mind on higher or at least other things, and hadn't called up, as any mere mortal might have done, to check if this was a convenient moment. He had just decreed it done. And it was done, bang. Devastation. And also the insurance problem from hell. the insurance companies involved had all claimed that this was, by any reasonable standards, an act of God. But, Dirk had argued, which God? Britain was constitutionally a Christian monotheistic state, and therefore any act of God defined in a legal document must refer to the Anglican chap in the stained glass and not to some polytheistic thug from Norway. And so on. Meanwhile, Dirk's house, not an especially grand place to start with, was propped up with scaffolding intended with polythene, and Dirk had no idea when he was going to be able to get it repaired. If the insurance company failed to pay up, which seemed increasingly likely in light of the strategy that insurance companies had adopted in recent years, of merely advertising their services rather than actually providing them, Dirk was going to have to, well, he didn't quite know what. He had no money. None. Of his own, at least. He had some of the bank's money, but how much he had? No idea. Justin, intoned the little voice. There was no answering response. Dirk tipped his unopened bank statements onto the kitchen table, and stared at them with loathing. It seemed to him for a moment that the envelopes were vibrating slightly, and even that the whole of space and time was beginning to revolve slowly around them and get sucked into their event horizon, but he was probably imagining it. Carl. Nothing. Carell. Kier. Nothing. Nothing. Dirk made some coffee, taking the long route round his kitchen, in order to avoid coming too close to his bank statements, now that he had put them down. Viewed in a certain light, the entire structure of his adult life could be seen as a means of avoiding opening his bank statements. Someone else's bank statements, now that was a different matter. He was rarely happier than when poring over someone else's bank statements. He always found them to be rich in color and narrative drive, particularly if he'd had to steam them open. But the prospect of opening his own gave him the screaming heebie-jeebies. Keith, said the voice, hopefully, nasally. Nothing. Kelvin. No. Dirk poured his coffee as slowly as he could, for he realized that the time had finally come. He had to open the statements and learn the worst. He selected the largest knife he could find and advanced on them, threateningly. Kendall. Silence. In the end he did it almost nonchalantly, with a sadistic little flick-slit movement. He quite enjoyed it, in fact, and even felt fashionably vicious. In a few seconds the 4 envelopes, his financial history of the last 4 months, were open. Dirk laid their contents out before him. Kendrick. Nothing. Kennedy. The tinny little voice was beginning to get on Dirk's nerves. He glanced at the corner of the room. 2 mournful eyes looked at him in silent bewilderment. As Dirk at last looked at the figures at the bottom of the last sheet of paper, a kind of swimmy feeling assailed him. He gasped sharply. The table began to bend and sway. He felt as if the hands of fate had started kneading his shoulders. He had imagined it was bad, in fact for the last few weeks he had imagined little else other than how bad it might be, but even in his worst imaginings he had no idea it might be this bad. Clammy things happened in his throat. He could not possibly be over £22,000 overdrawn. He pushed his chair back from the kitchen table, and for a few moments just sat there, throbbing. £22,000. The word Kenneth floated mockingly through the room. As he rapidly cast his mind back over what he could remember of his expenditures over the last few weeks, an ill-considered shirt here, a reckless bun there, a wild weekend in the Isle of Wight, he realized that he must be right. He could not possibly be £22,000 overdrawn. He took a deep breath and looked at the figures once more. There it was again. £22,347.43. There must be some mistake. Some terrible, terrible mistake. The chances were, of course, that he had made it, and as he stared, trembling, at the paper, he realized, quite suddenly, that he had. He had been looking for a negative number and had therefore assumed that that was what he was looking at. In fact, his account stood at £22,347.43. In credit. Credit. He'd never known such a thing. Didn't even know what it looked like. Hadn't recognized it. Slowly, carefully, almost as if the figures might fall off the page and get lost on the floor, he sifted through the sheets one by one to try to find out where on earth all this money had come from. Kenny, Kentigern, and Kermit slipped by unheard. It was immediately clear that it was regular amounts that had been coming in, once a week. There had been 7 of them, so far. The most recent one had come in the Friday before last, which was as far as these statements went. The odd thing was that though the amounts were regular, they were untidy amounts, similar each week, but not exactly the same. The previous Friday's payment was £3,267.34. The previous Thursdays, they had each come in at the end of the week, 3 of them on a Thursday, 4 on a Friday, was for £3,232.57. The week before it had been £3,319.14. And so on. Dirk stood up and took a deep breath. What the hell was going on? He felt that his whole world was spinning very slowly in what was, as far as he could judge, an anti-clockwise direction. That prompted a vague recollection that the last time he had drunk any tequila, it had made his world spin slowly in a clockwise direction. That was obviously what he needed if he was going to be able to think about this clearly. He rummaged hurriedly through a cupboard full of dusty 9/10 empty bottles of half-forgotten rums and whiskeys and found a half-full bottle of mezcal. He poured himself a finger in the bottom of a teacup and hurriedly returned to his statements, suddenly panicking in case the figures vanished while he wasn't looking. They were still there. Irregularly large sums regularly paid in. His head began to swim again. What were they? Interest payments that had been accidentally credited to the wrong account? If they were interest payments, that would account for the fluctuations in the amounts. But it still didn't make sense for the simple reason that over £3,000 interest a week represented the interest on £2 or £3 million and was not the sort of thing that the owner of such an amount of money was going to allow to be misplaced, let alone for 7 weeks in a row. He took a pull on the mezcal. It marched around his mouth, waving its fists, waited a moment or two, and then started to beat up his brain. He wasn't thinking rationally about this, he realized. The problem was that they were his own accounts, and he was used to reading other people's. Since they were his own, it was in fact possible for him just to phone up the bank and ask. Except that, of course, they'd be closed now. And he had a horrible feeling that if he phoned them up, the response would be whoops. Sorry, wrong account. Thank you for bringing this error to our attention. How stupid of us to imagine that this money could possibly belong to you. Obviously he had to try to work out where it was from before he asked the bank. In fact, he had to get the money out of the bank before he asked them. He probably had to get to Fiji or somewhere before he asked them. Except, suppose the money continued to come in? On reapplying his attention to the papers, he realized something else that would have occurred to him straight away if he hadn't been so flustered. There was, of course, a code next to each entry. The purpose of the code was to tell him what kind of entry it was. He looked the code up. Easy. Each payment had reached his account by international transfer. That would also account for the fluctuations. International exchange rates. If the same amount of a foreign currency was being transferred each week, then the variations in the rate would ensure that a slightly differing amount actually arrived on each occasion. It would also explain why it didn't arrive on exactly the same day each week, although it only took less than a second. To make a computerized international transfer of money, the banks liked to make as much fuss as they possibly could about it so that the funds would swill around profitably in their system for a while. But which country were the payments coming from? And why? Kevin, said the Irish-Swedish voice. Kieran. Oh, shut up, shouted Dirk suddenly. That provoked a response. The small border terrier lying, perplexed, in a basket in the corner of the room looked up excitedly and yipped with pleasure. It had not reacted at all to any of the names that the elderly computer on the table next to it had been reciting from a text file of babies' names, but the creature obviously just enjoyed being told to shut up and was keen for more. Kimberly, said the computer. Nothing. The dog with no name looked disappointed. Kirby. Kirk. The dog slowly settled back down into its basket of old newspapers and resumed its previous posture of baffled distress. Old newspapers. That was what Dirk needed. A couple of hours later he had the answer, or at least some kind of an answer. Nothing that went so far as to make any kind of actual sense, but enough to make Dirk feel an encouraging surge of excitement. He had managed to unlock a part of the puzzle. How big a part he didn't know. As yet he had no idea how big a puzzle he was dealing with. No idea at all. He had collected a representative sample of the newspapers of the last few weeks from under the dog, under the sofa, under his bed, scattered around the bathroom, and, crucially, had managed to secure 2 damp but vital copies of the Financial Times from an old tramp in return for a blanket, some cider, and a copy of The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. An odd request, he thought, as he walked back from the tiny scrap of park, but probably no odder than his. He was constantly reminded of how startlingly different a place the world was when viewed from a point only 3 feet to the left. Using the figures from the papers, he was able to construct a map of the movements of each of the world's major currencies over the last few weeks and see how they compared with the fluctuations in the amounts that had been paid into his account every week. The answer sprang into focus immediately. US dollars. 5,000 of them, to be precise. If $5,000 had been transferred from the US to the UK every week, then it would have arrived as more or less exactly the amounts that had been showing up in his account. Eureka! Time for a celebratory fridge raid. Dirk hunkered down in front of the TV with 3 slices of cold pizza and a can of beer, put on the radio as well, and also a ZZ Top CD. He needed to think. Someone was paying him $5,000 a week, and had been doing so for 7 weeks. This was astounding news. He ruminated on his pizza. Not only that, but he was being paid by someone in America. He took another bite, rich in cheese, pepperoni, spicy minced beef, anchovy, and egg. He hadn't spent much time in America and didn't know anyone there, or indeed anywhere else on the Earth's crust, who would be wantonly shoveling unsolicited bucks at him like this. Another thought struck him, but this time it wasn't about the money. A ZZ Top song about TV dinners made him think for a moment about his pizza, and he looked at it with sudden puzzlement. Cheese, pepperoni, spicy minced beef, anchovy, and egg. No wonder he'd had indigestion today. The other 3 slices were what he'd had for breakfast. It was a combination to which he, probably uniquely in all the world, was addicted, and which he had some months ago forsworn because his gut couldn't cope with it anymore. He Hadn't thought twice about it when he'd blundered across it in the fridge this morning because it was exactly the sort of thing a person liked to find in a fridge. It hadn't occurred to him to ask who had put it there. But it hadn't been him. Slowly, disgustingly, he removed the half-chewed portion from his mouth. He didn't believe in the pizza fairy. He disposed of the half-masticated gungy bits and then examined the 2 remaining slices. There was nothing unusual or suspicious about them at all. It was exactly the pizza he regularly used to eat until he made himself give it up. He phoned his local pizza restaurant and asked them if anybody else had been in to buy a pizza with that particular combination of toppings. "Ah, you're the bloke who has the gastriciana, are you?" said the pizza chef. "The what?" "It's what we call it." "No, mate, nobody else has ever bought that wonderful combination, believe me." Dirk felt somewhat dissatisfied with aspects of this conversation, but he let it pass. He put the phone down thoughtfully. He felt that something very strange was going on and he didn't know what. "No one knows anything." The words caught his attention and he glanced up at the TV. A breezy Californian in the sort of Hawaiian shirt that could serve, if needed, as a distress signal was standing in the bright sunshine and answering questions. Dirk quickly worked out about the approaching meteor. He called the meteor Toodle Pip. "Toodle Pip?" asked his interviewer, the BBC's California correspondent. "Yeah. We call it Toodle Pip because anything it hits, you could pretty much say goodbye to." The Californian grinned. "So you're saying it is going to hit?" "I'm saying I don't know." "Nobody knows." "Well, the scientists at NASA are saying." "NASA," said the Californian genially, "is talking shit. They don't know." "If we don't know, they sure as hell don't know. Here at Similarity Engines, we have the most massively powerful parallel computers on Earth, so when I say we don't know, I know what I'm talking about. We know that we don't know, and we know why we don't know. NASA doesn't even know that." The next item on the news was also from California, and was about a lobby group called Green Shoots, which was attracting a lot of support. Its view, and it was one that spoke to the battered psyches of many Americans, was that the world was much better able to take care of itself than we were. So there was no point in getting all worked up about it or trying to moderate our natural behavior. "Don't worry," said their slogan, quoting the title of a popular song. "Be happy." "Great balls of fire," thought Dirk to himself, quoting another. "Scientists in Australia," said someone on the radio, "are trying to teach kangaroos to speak." Dirk decided that what he most needed was a good night's sleep. In the morning, things suddenly seemed wonderfully clear and simple. He didn't know the answer to anything, but he knew what to do about it. A few phone calls to the bank had established that tracing the money back to its origins was going to be hideously difficult, partly because it was an inherently complicated business anyway, partly because it quickly became clear that whoever had been paying the money to him had taken some trouble to cover his or her tracks, but mostly because the man on the foreign desk at his bank had a cleft palate. Life was too short, the weather too fine, and the world too full of interesting and exciting pitfalls. Dirk would go sailing. Life, he was fond of telling himself, was like an ocean. You can either grind your way across it like a motorboat or you can follow the winds and the currents, in other words, go sailing. He had the wind, he was being paid by someone. Presumably that someone was paying him to do something, but what he had omitted to say, well, that was a client's privilege. But Dirk felt that he should respond to this generous urge to pay him, that he should do something. But what? Well, he was a private detective, and what private detectives did when they were being paid was mostly to follow people. So that was simple. Dirk would follow someone. Which meant that now he had to find a good current, someone to follow. Well, there was his office window, with the whole world surging by outside it. Or a few people at least. He would pick one. He began to tingle with excitement that his investigation was finally underway, or would be as soon as the next person, no, not the next person, the fifth next person walked around the corner that he could see on the other side of the road. He was immediately glad that he had decided to build in a brief period of mental preparation. Almost immediately number 1, a large duvet of a woman, came around the corner with numbers 2 and 3 being dragged unwillingly along with her, her children, whom she nagged and scolded. With every step, Dirk breathed a sigh of relief that it wasn't going to be her. He stood by the side of his window, quiet with anticipation. For a few minutes no one further came round the corner. Dirk watched as the large woman bullied her 2 children into the newsagent opposite, despite their wails that they wanted to go home and watch TV. A minute or 2 later she bullied them back out into the sunshine again, despite their wails that they wanted an ice cream and a Judge Dredd comic. She yanked them away up the road, and the scene fell quiet. The scene was a triangular-shaped one, because of the angle at which 2 roads collided with each other. Dirk had recently moved to this new office. New to him, that was, the actual building was old and dilapidated and remained standing more out of habit than from any inherent structural integrity. And much preferred it to his previous one, which was miles from anywhere. In his old one he could have waited all week for 5 people to walk around a corner. Number 4 appeared. Number 4 was a postman with a pushcart. A small bead of perspiration appeared on Dirk's forehead as he began to realize how badly wrong his plan could go. And here was number 5. Number 5 almost lurched into sight. He was in his late 20s, tallish, with ginger hair and a black leather bomber jacket. Having arrived round the corner, he then stopped and stood still for a moment. He looked around as if half expecting to meet somebody. Dirk started to move, when suddenly number 6 walked round the corner. Number 6 was a different proposition altogether, a rather delicious-looking woman in jeans, with short, thick black hair. Dirk swore to himself and wondered if he hadn't secretly meant 6 instead of 5. But no. An undertaking was an undertaking, and he was being paid a lot of money. He owed it to whoever was paying the money to stick to whatever agreement it was that they hadn't actually got. Number 5 was still standing there, dithering on the street corner, and Dirk hurried quickly downstairs to take up the chase. As he opened the cracked front door he was met by number 4, the postman with the pushcart, who handed him a small bundle of letters. Dirk pocketed them and hurried out into the street and the spring sunshine. He hadn't followed anybody for quite a while, and discovered that he had lost the knack. He set off so enthusiastically in pursuit of his quarry that he realized he was walking far too quickly and would in fact have to walk straight past him. He did so, paused for a few confused seconds, turned round, and started to walk back, which caused him to collide directly with his quarry. Dirk was so flummoxed to find that he had actually physically hit the person he was supposed to be stealthily tailing that in order to allay any suspicion he jumped onto a passing bus and headed off down Roseberry Avenue. This, he felt, was not an auspicious beginning. He sat on the bus for a few seconds, completely stunned at his own ineptness. He was being paid $5,000 a week for this. Well, in a sense he was. He became aware that people were looking at him slightly oddly. But not nearly as oddly, he reflected, as they would do if they had the slightest idea about what he was actually doing. He twisted round in his seat and squinted back down the road, wondering what would be a good next move. Normally, if you were tailing somebody, it was a problem if they unexpectedly jumped onto a bus, but it was almost more of a problem if you unexpectedly jumped on one yourself. It was probably best if he just got off again and tried to resume the trail, though how on earth he was going to look unobtrusive now, he didn't know. As soon as the bus next came to a halt, he jumped off again and started walking back up Roseberry Avenue. Before he had gone very far, he noticed his quarry walking down the road in his direction. He reflected that he had managed to pick a remarkably helpful and cooperative subject, and better than he deserved. Time to get a grip and be a little more circumspect. He was almost at the door of a small cafe, so he ducked inside it. He stood at the counter, pretending to dither for a moment over the sandwiches until he sensed that the subject had passed. The subject didn't pass. The subject walked in and stood behind him at the counter. In a panic, Dirk ordered a tuna and sweet corn roll, which he hated, and a cappuccino, which went particularly badly with fish, and hurried off to sit at one of the small tables. He wanted to be able to bury himself in a newspaper, but he didn't have one, so he had to make do with his post. He pored over it intently. Various bills of the usual preposterous and wildly over-optimistic kind. Various circulars of the strange type that private detectives tended to receive, catalogs full of tiny electronic gadgets all designed to counteract each other, ads for peculiar grades of film or revolutionary new types of thin plastic strips. Dirk couldn't be bothered with any of it, though he did pause for a moment over a flyer for a newly published book on advanced surveillance techniques. He screwed it up crossly and threw it on the floor. The last envelope was another bank statement. His bank had long ago got into the habit of sending them to him on a weekly basis, just to make the point, really. They hadn't yet adjusted to his new sheen of solvency, or didn't trust it. Probably hadn't even noticed it, in fact. He opened the statement, still only half believing. Yes. Another £3,253 and 29 pence. Last Friday. Incredible. Inexplicable. But there was also something else odd, though. It took him a moment or two to spot it, because he was keeping half an eye expertly trained on his subject. Who was buying coffee and a donut and paying for it out of a fan of 20s? The last entry on Dirk's statement was for a cash withdrawal on his debit card, £500. Yesterday. The statement had obviously been sent out at close of business yesterday, and it had the day's transactions up to date. That was all. Very excellent and efficient, and a fine testimony to the efficacy of modern computer technology, of course, but the fact was that Dirk hadn't withdrawn £500 yesterday, or any other day for that matter. His card must have been stolen. Hell's bells. He fished anxiously for his wallet. No. His cards were there. Safe. He thought about it. He couldn't envisage any way in which a fraudster could make an actual cash withdrawal without the actual card. A horrible, clammy thought suddenly grabbed his stomach. These were his own bank statements he'd been getting, weren't they? He checked in alarm. Yes. His name, his address, his account number. He had double-checked the other ones. Last night, several times. Definitely his statements. They just didn't seem to be his financial transactions, that was all. Time to concentrate on the job in hand. He looked up. His quarry was sitting 2 tables away, patiently munching his bun and staring into the middle distance. After a moment or two he stood up, brushed some crumbs off his leather jacket, turned, and walked to the door. He paused for a moment, as if considering which way to go, and then set off the way he had been going. Strolling casually. Dirk slipped his mail into his pocket and quietly followed. He had picked a good subject, he soon realized. The man's ginger hair shone like a beacon in the spring sunshine, so whenever he was briefly swallowed up in a crowd, it would only be a matter of seconds before Dirk would catch sight of him again, meandering idly along the street. Dirk wondered what he did for a living. Not a lot, it seemed, or at least not a lot today. A pleasant walk through Holborn and into the West End. Loafing around in a couple of bookshops for half an hour, Dirk made a note of the titles his quarry browsed through, stopping for another coffee in an Italian cafe to glance through a copy of The Stage, which probably explained why he had so much free time for loafing around in bookshops and Italian cafes, and then a long, leisurely amble up through Regent's Park and then across Camden and back toward Islington. Dirk began to think that this business of following people was really a rather congenial one. Fresh air, exercise, he was feeling in such tremendously good spirits by the end of the day that as soon he strode back and through his front door, or rather, his front polythene flap, it was instantly clear to him that the dog's name was Kierkegaard. Chapter 5. Solutions nearly always come from the direction you least expect. Which means there's no point trying to look in that direction because it won't be coming from there. This was an observation that Dirk mentioned a lot to people, and he mentioned it again to Kate that evening when he phoned her. Wait a minute, she said, trying to wedge a phrase into his monologue and wiggle it about. Are you telling me? I'm telling you that the late husband of the woman who's forgotten her dog's name was a biographer. But, and I expect you know that biographers often name their pets after their subjects. No. It's so they've got someone to shout at when they get fed up. You spend hours wading through someone banging on about the teleological suspension of the ethical or whatever, and sometimes you just need to be able to shout, "Oh, shut up, Kierkegaard, for Christ's sake." Hence the dog. Dir. Some biographers use a small wooden ornament or a potted plant, but most prefer something you can get a good yap out of. Feedback, you see. Speaking of which, do I sense that you have an observation to make? Dirk, are you telling me that you spent all day following a total stranger? Absolutely. And I intend to do the same tomorrow. I shall be skulking near his front door bright and early. Well, bright at least. No point in being early. He's an actor. You could get locked up for that. Occupational hazard. Kate, I'm being paid $5,000 a week. You have to be prepared to, but not to follow a total stranger. Whoever is employing me knows my methods. I am applying them. You don't know anything about the person who's employing you. On the contrary, I know a great deal. All right, what's his name? Frank. Frank what? No idea. Look, I don't know that his name is Frank. His, or her, name has nothing to do with it. The point is that they have a problem. The problem is serious, or they wouldn't be paying me a substantial amount of money to solve it. And the problem is ineffable, or they'd tell me what it is. Whoever it is knows who I am, where I am, and precisely how best to reach me. Or maybe the bank's just made an error. Hard to believe, I know, but Kate, you think I'm talking nonsense, but I'm not. Listen. In the past, people would stare into the fire for hours when they wanted to think. Or stare at the sea. The endless dancing shapes and patterns would reach far deeper into our minds than we could manage by reason and logic. You see, logic can only proceed from the premises and assumptions we already make, so we just drive round and round in little circles like little clockwork cars. We need dancing shapes to lift us and carry us, but they're harder to find these days. You can't stare into a radiator. You can't stare into the sea. Well, you can, but it's covered with plastic bottles and used condoms, so you just sit there, getting cross. All we have to stare into is the white noise. The stuff we sometimes call information, but which is really just a babble rising in the air. But without logic. Logic comes afterwards. It's how we retrace our steps. It's being wise. After the event. Before the event you have to be very silly. Ah. So that's what you're doing? Yes. Well, it solved one problem already. I've no idea how long it would have taken me to work out that the wretched dog was called Kierkegaard. It was only by the happiest of chances that my surveillance subject happened to pick out a biography of Kierkegaard, which I then discovered, when I checked it out myself, had been written by the man who subsequently threw himself off a crane with elastic round his legs. But the two cases had nothing to do with each other. Have I mentioned that I believe in the fundamental connectedness of all things? I think I have. Yes. Which is why I must now go and investigate some of the other books he was interested in before getting myself ready for tomorrow's expedition. I can hear you shaking your head in sorrow and bewilderment. Don't worry. Everything is getting nicely out of control. If you say so, Dirk. Oh, by the way, what does ineffable actually mean? I don't know, said Dirk tersely, but I intend to find out. Chapter 6. The following morning the weather was so foul it hardly deserved the name, and Dirk decided to call it Stanley instead. Stanley wasn't a good downpour. Nothing wrong with a good downpour for clearing the air. Stanley was the sort of thing you needed a good downpour to clear the air of. Stanley was muggy, close, and oppressive, like someone large and sweaty pressed up against you in a tube train. Stanley didn't rain, but every so often he dribbled on you. Dirk stood outside in the Stanley. The actor had kept him waiting for over an hour now, and Dirk was beginning to wish that he had stuck by his own opinion that actors never got up in the morning. Instead of which he had turned up rather eagerly outside the actor's flat at about 8:30 and then stood behind a tree for an hour. Nearly an hour and a half now. There was a brief moment of excitement when a motorcycle messenger arrived and delivered a small package, but that was about it. Dirk lurked about 20 yards from the actor's door. The motorcycle messenger arrival incident had surprised him a bit. The actor didn't seem to be a particularly prosperous one. He looked as if he were more in the still knocking on people's doors bit of his career than in the having scripts biked round to him bit. Time dragged by. Dirk had read through the small collection of newspapers he'd brought with him twice, and checked through the contents of his wallet and pockets several times, the usual collection of business cards for people he had no recollection of meeting, unidentifiable phone numbers on scraps of paper, credit cards, checkbook, his passport. He had suddenly remembered that he had left it in another jacket when his quarry had paused for a longish time at the window of a travel agent yesterday. His toothbrush. He never traveled without his toothbrush, with the result that it was completely unusable, and his notebook. He even consulted his own horoscope in one of the papers, the one written by a disreputable friend of his who toiled unscrupulously under the name of the Great Zaganza. First he glanced at some of the entries under other birth signs, just to get a feel for the kind of mood the GZ was in. Mellow, it seemed, at first sight. Your ability to take the long view will help you though. Some of the minor difficulties you experience when Mercury passed. Weeks of stranger patience, but new possibilities will now start to emerge as the sun. Beware of allowing others to take advantage of your good nature. Resolve will be especially called for when boring, humdrum stuff He read his own horoscope. Today you will meet a 3-ton rhinoceros called Desmond. Dirk clapped the paper shut in irritation, and at that moment the door suddenly opened. The actor emerged with a purposeful air. He was carrying a small suitcase, a shoulder bag, and a coat. Something was happening. Dirk glanced at his watch. 3 minutes past 10. He made a quick note in his book. His pulse quickened. A taxi was coming down the street towards them. The actor hailed it. Damn. Something as simple as that. He was going to get away. The actor climbed into the cab and it drove off down the street, past Dirk. Dirk swiveled to watch it, and caught a momentary glimpse of the actor looking back through the rear window. Dirk watched helplessly and then glanced up and down the street in the vain hope that, almost miraculously, a second taxi appeared suddenly at the top of the street, heading towards him. Dirk shot out an arm, and it drew to a halt beside him. "Follow that cab," exclaimed Dirk, clambering into the back. "I've been a cabbie over 20 years now," said the cabbie as he slid back into the traffic. "Never had anybody actually say that to me." Dirk sat perched on the edge of his seat, watching the cab in front as it threaded its way through the slow, agonizing throttle of the London traffic. "Now that may seem like a little thing to you, but it's interesting, innit?" "What?" said Dirk. "Anytime you see anything on the telly where someone jumps in a cab, it's always follow that cab, innit? Is it?" "I've never noticed," said Dirk. "Well, you wouldn't," said the cabbie. "You're not a cabbie. What you notice depends on who you are. If you're a cabbie, then what you especially notice when you watch the telly," continued the cabbie, "is the cabbies. See what the cabbies are up to. See? Yes," said Dirk. "But on the telly you never actually see the cabbies, see? You only see the people in the back of the cab. Like, the cabbies never of any interest." I suppose so," said Dirk. Can you still see the cab we're supposed to be following?" "Oh yeah, I'm following him okay." "So, the only time you ever actually see the cabbie is when a fare says something to him. And when a fare says something to a cabbie in a drama, you know what it invariably is?" "Let me guess," said Dirk. "It's follow that cab." "Exactly my point. So if what you see on the telly is to be believed, all cabbies ever do," continued the cabbie, "is follow other cabbies." Said Dirk, doubtfully. "Which leaves me in a very strange position, as being the one cabbie that never gets asked to follow another cabbie. Which leads me to the unmistakable conclusion that I must be the cabbie all the other cabbies are following." Dirk squinted out of the window, trying to spot if there was another cab he could switch to. "Now, I'm not saying that's what's actually happening, but you can see how someone might get to thinking that way, can't you? It's the power of the media, innit?" "There was," said Dirk, "an entire television series about taxi drivers. It was called, as I recall, Taxi." "Yeah, well, I'm not talking about that, am I?" said the cabbie, irrefutably. "I'm talking about the power of the media to selectively distort reality. That's what I'm talking about. I mean, when it comes down to it, we all live in our own different reality, don't we? I mean, when it comes down to it." "Well, yes, I think you're right as a matter of fact," said Dirk, uneasily. "I mean, you take these kangaroos they're trying to teach language to. What does anyone think we're going to talk about? What are we going to say, then? So, how's the hopping life treating you then?" "Oh fine, mustn't grumble. This pocket down me front's a bit of a pain, though, always full of fluff and paper clips. It isn't going to be like that. These kangaroos have got brains the size of a walnut. They live in a different world, see? It would be like trying to talk to John Selwyn Gummer. You see what I'm saying? Can you see the cab we're following? Clear as a bell. Probably be there before him. Dirk frowned. Be where before him? Heathrow. How on earth do you know he's going to Heathrow? Any cabbie can tell if another cabbie's going to Heathrow. What do you mean? You read the signs. Okay, so there's certain obvious things, like the fares. Carrying luggage. Then there's the route he's taking. That's easy. But, you say, he may just be going to stay with friends in Hammersmith. All I can say is, the fare didn't get into the cab in the manner of someone going to stay with friends in Hammersmith. So, what else do you look for? Well, here's where. You need to be a cabbie to know. Normal life for a cabbie is lots of little bits. Here and there. You don't know from minute to minute what's going to happen, what work you're going to get, how the day's going to go. You kind of prowl around in a restless kind of way. But if you get a fare to Heathrow, you're away. Good solid journey, good solid fare, wait in line for an hour or so, get a good solid fare back to town. That's your whole morning taken care of. You drive in a completely different way. You're higher up on the road. You take better lines through corners. You're on your way. You're going somewhere. It's called doing the Heathrow hop. Any cabbie'll spot it. Said Dirk. That's remarkable. What you notice depends on who you are. You couldn't happen to tell which flight he's catching, could you? Asked Dirk. Who do you think I am, mate? Retorted the cabbie, a bloody private detective? Dirk sat back in his seat and stared out of the window thoughtfully. Chapter 7. There must be some kind of disease that causes people to talk like that. And the name for it must be something like airline syllable stress syndrome. It's the disease that seems to kick in at about 10,000 feet and becomes more and more pronounced, if that's a good word to use in this context, with altitude until it levels out at a plateau of complete nonsense at about 35,000 feet. It makes otherwise rational people start saying things like the captain has now turned off the seatbelt sign, as if there were someone lurking around the cockpit attempting to deny that the captain has done any such thing. That he is indeed the captain and not an imposter, and that there aren't a whole bunch of second-rate and inferior seatbelt signs that he mightn't have been fiddling about with. Another thing that Dirk reflected on as he settled back into his seat was the curious coincidence that not only does the outside of an aircraft look like the outside of a vacuum cleaner, but also that the inside of an aircraft smells like the inside of a vacuum cleaner. He accepted a glass of champagne from the cabin steward. He supposed that most of the words that airline staff used, or rather most of the sentences into which they were habitually arranged, had been worked so hard that they had died. The strange stresses that cabin stewards continually thumped them with were like electric shocks applied to heart attack victims in an attempt to revive them. Well, what a strange and complicated hour and a half that had been. Dirk was still by no means sure that something somewhere had not gone terribly wrong, and he was tempted, now that the seatbelt sign had been turned off by the captain, to go and take a bit of a casual stroll through the aircraft to have a look for his quarry. But no one was going to be getting on or off the aircraft for a little while now, so he would probably be wiser to restrain himself for an hour or even longer. It was, after all, an 11-hour flight to Los Angeles. He had not been expecting to go to Chicago today, and the sight of his quarry making a beeline for the check-in desk for the 13:30 flight to Chicago had made him lurch. However, a resolution was a resolution, so after a brief pause to make sure that his quarry hadn't merely gone up to the check-in desk to ask directions to the tie shop, Dirk had made his way lightheadedly to the ticket sales desk and slammed plastic. Overwhelmed with his sudden solvency, he had even booked himself business class. His anonymous employer was obviously someone of means. Who was not going to quibble over a few minor expenses? Suppose his Corey was traveling business class? Dirk would not be able to keep tabs on him from a seat stuck in the back of the plane. There was almost an argument. They're for traveling first class, but not, Dirk reluctantly admitted to himself, a sane one. But, an hour and a half after the plane had taken off, Dirk was beginning to wonder. As a business class passenger, he was denied access to the first class section up in the nose of the plane, but could wander freely wherever else he liked. He had wandered freely up and down each aisle 3 times. Now, surreptitiously watched each of the toilet doors, and seen his quarry nowhere. He returned to his seat and pondered the situation. Either his quarry was in the first-class cabin or he was not on the plane. First class? He just didn't look it. The fare would be quite a few months. Rent on his flat. But who knows? Maybe he had caught the eye of a Hollywood casting director who was whisking him over for a screen test. It wouldn't be difficult to slip into the first-class cabin and have a quick look around, but it would be difficult to do it without attracting attention. Not on the plane? Dirk had seen him heading in towards passport control. But there had been a moment when he had suddenly looked round and Dirk had ducked quickly into the bookshop. A few seconds later, when Dirk next glanced up, his quarry had gone into, Dirk had assumed, passport control. Dirk had lingered for a decent interval, bought some newspapers and books, and then made his way through passport control and into the departure area himself. It had not especially surprised him that he had not spotted his quarry anywhere in the departure area. It was a shining maze of pointless shops, cafes, and lounges, and Dirk felt that there was nothing to be gained by rushing around hunting for him. They were being funneled inexorably in the same direction and way. They'd be on the same plane. Not on the plane? Dirk sat stock still. Thinking back, he had to admit that the last time he had actually physically seen his quarry was before he had even gone through passport control, and that everything else was based on the assumption that his quarry was going to do what he, Dirk, had decided he was going to do. This, he now realized, was actually quite a large assumption. Cold air trickled down his neck from the nozzle above him. Yesterday he had inexpertly boarded a bus while tailing this man. Today, it seemed, he had inadvertently boarded a plane to Chicago. He put his hand to his brow and asked himself, honestly, how good a private detective he really was. He summoned a cabin steward and ordered a glass of whiskey, and nursed it as if it were very ill indeed. After a while he reached into his plastic bag of books and newspapers. He might as well just pass the time. He sighed. He drew out of the bag something he had no recollection of putting there. It was a courier delivery packet, which had already been opened. With a slow frown developing on his forehead, he pulled out its contents. There was a book inside. He turned it over, wonderingly. It was called Advanced Surveillance Techniques. He recognized it. He'd had a flyer for it yesterday. In the post. He'd screwed it up and thrown it to the floor. Folded between a couple of pages of the book was the exact same flyer, flattened and smoothed out. With a deep sense of foreboding, Dirk slowly unfolded it. Scrawled across it in felt tip, in handwriting that was oddly familiar, were the words, Bon voyage. The cabin steward leaned across him. Can I freshen your drink, sir? He said. Chapter 8. The sun stood high above the distant Pacific. The day was bright, the sky blue and cloudless, the air, if you like the smell of burnt carpets, perfect. Los Angeles. A city I have never visited. A car, a blue convertible, sleek and desirable, came sweeping west out of Beverly Hills along the, as I understand it, gracious curves of Sunset Boulevard. Anybody seeing such a car would have wanted it. Obviously. It was designed to make you want it. If people had turned out not to want it very much, the makers would have redesigned it until they did. The world is now full of things like this, which is, of course, why everybody is in such a permanent state of want. The driver was a woman, and I can tell you for a fact that she was very beautiful. She had fine dark hair cut in a bob, and as she drove, her hair riffled in the warm breeze. I would tell you about what she wore, but I'm very bad at clothes, and if I started telling you that it was an Armani this or a what's her name farty that, you would know instinctively that I was faking it. And since you are taking the trouble to read what I have written, I intend to treat you with respect even if I do, occasionally and in a friendly and well-meaning kind of way, lie to you. So I'll just say that the clothes she was wearing were exactly the sort of clothes that someone who knew vastly more about clothes than I do would admire enormously, and were blue. Impossibly. Tall palm trees towered above her, silent Mexicans moved over impossibly. Perfect lawns. The gates of Bel Air went by, and behind them, perfect houses nestling in perfect bouquets of shrubbery. I've seen exactly those houses on television. And even I, skeptical and sarcastic old me, have felt that I really wanted one of them. Luckily, the sort of the things that people who live in such houses say to each other make me giggle until tea squirts out of my nose. And so the moment passes. The sleek, desirable blue convertible swept on. There is a set of traffic lights, I understand, on the borders of Bel Air and Brentwood, and as the car approached them, they turned red. The car drew to a halt. The woman shook her hair and adjusted her sunglasses in the mirror. As she did so, she caught sight of a brief flicker of movement in the mirror as a small, dark-haired figure emerged quietly from the shade of the roadside and snuck round the back of the car. A moment later he was leaning right over her, pointing a small handgun into her face. I know even less about handguns than I do about clothes. I'd be completely hopeless in Los Angeles. I'd be laughed at not only for my lack of dress sense but also my pitiful inability to tell a Magnum .38 from a Walther PPK or even, for heaven's sake, a Derringer. I do know, however, that the gun was also blue, or at least blue-black, and that the woman was startled out of her wits to have it pointed into her left eye from a range of just under 1 inch. Her assailant gave her to understand that now would be an excellent moment for her to vacate her seat and, no, not to take the key out of the car or even to attempt to pick up her bag, which was lying on the seat next to her, but just to be very cool, move very easily, very gently, and just get the fuck out of the car. The woman tried to be very cool, to move very easily and very gently, but was hampered by the fact that she was shaking with uncontrollable fear as the gun bobbed about just an inch or so from her face like a mayfly in the summer. She did, however, get the fuck out of the car. She stood trembling in the middle of the road as the thief jumped into the car in her place, gunned the engine in a quick roar of triumph, and careered sharply off along Sunset Boulevard, around the bend, and away. She twisted around on the spot in an agony of shocked helplessness. Her world had turned abruptly upside down and tipped her out of it, and she was now, suddenly and unexpectedly, that most helpless of all people in Los Angeles, a pedestrian. She tried to wave down one or two of the other cars on the road, but they maneuvered politely past her. One of them was an open-topped Mustang with the radio playing loudly. I'd love to be able to say that it was tuned to an oldies station and that the words "How does it feel? How does it?" Feel, snarled out at this moment, but there are limits even to fiction. It was an oldies station, but the old song it was playing was Sunday Girl by Blondie, and so wasn't even remotely appropriate, seeing as this was a Thursday. What could she do? Another perfect crime. Another perfect day in the city of angels. And only one tiny little lie. Forgive me. Chapter 9. If there is an uglier building in England than Ranting Manor, then I haven't seen it. It must be hiding somewhere and not, like Ranting Manor, squatting in the middle of 100 acres of rolling parkland. The original estate consisted of many more hundreds of acres that were the pride of Oxfordshire, but generations of syphilitic idiocy and blitheringness have reduced it to its current decrepit state, an ill-kempt bunch of woods, fields, and lawns littered with the results of various failed attempts to raise money by whatever means seemed to someone like a good idea at the time, a godforsaken fun fair, a once quite well-stocked zoo, and, of more recent provenance, a small high-technology business park, current occupant one faltering computer games company, now cast adrift by its American parent, and believed to be the only such company in the world making a loss. You could find a billion-barrel oil field in the grounds of Ranting Manor, and you could pretty much guarantee that within a couple of years it would be operating at a loss, and would require the selling of the family tin to keep it going. The family silver has long since gone, of course, along with most of the family disease, alcohol, drugs, sexual imbecility, and poorly maintained road vehicles have combined to cut vicious swathes through the ranks of the Rantings and reduce them to almost none. How much history would you like? Maybe just a very little. The manor itself dates back to the 13th century, or at least bits of it do. The bits are all that remain of the original monastery, inhabited for a couple of centuries or so by a devout order of calligraphers and pederasts. Then Henry VIII got his mitts on it and handed it over to a courtly scumbag called John Ranting, in return for some spectacular piece of loyal villainy. He knocked it down and rebuilt it after his own pleasure, which was probably pleasing enough, seeing as the architects of the Tudor period pretty much knew what they were doing. Stout beams, nice plasterwork and leaded windows, all the things we now value enormously, but that John Ranting's descendants, unfortunately, did not. Especially the Victorian rubber magnate Sir Percy Ranting, who, in the 1860s, tore much of it down and rebuilt it as a hunting lodge. These Victorian hunting lodges were built because the immensely wealthy merchants of the age were not supposed to parade their actual penises around in public, instead of which vast tracts of pretty and innocent English countryside had their erections inflicted upon them. Big, bulbous, ruddy buildings with vast ballrooms, grand, angular staircases, and as many turrets and crenellations as a recreational condom. The 19th century was, in aesthetic terms, disastrous enough for Ranting Manor, but right slap bang after it, of course, came the 20th. With all its architectural theories and double glazing. The main additions during this period were, in the 30s, a sort of large Nazi billiard room and, in the 60s, an indoor swimming pool, tiled in orange and purple, to which were now added various clumps of brightly colored fungus. The thing that binds all these different styles together is a general air of dampness and decay, and a sense that if a public-spirited citizen tried to set the place alight, it would go out well before the fire brigade arrived. What else? Oh yes. It's haunted. Enough of the wretched building. At about 10:30 in the evening, which would make it roughly the same time that the car was being stolen on Sunset Boulevard, a small perimeter gate squeaked open. The main iron gates to the estate were kept locked at night, but the side gate was usually to be found unfastened. A reputation for being an unwholesome and troublesome place was usually enough to deter any intruders. An old sign on the main gate said "Beware of the dog," beneath which someone had scrawled, "Why single out the dog?" Particularly, the figures of, respectively, a large dog and a small man slipped in through the side gate. Both walked with a pronounced limp. The dog limped on its left foreleg, the man on his right leg, or, to be more accurate, not on his right leg because he didn't have one. It was missing beneath the knee. Instead, the man limped on a wooden leg that was a full inch longer than his left leg and made walking not merely difficult, but actually rather a trial. The night was dull. The moon was up, or at least half of it was, but for the most part it was shrouded in clouds. The two shadowy figures limped their way in unison along the driveway, resembling, from a distance, a child's pulling toy with a couple of off-center wheels. They were taking the long way to the house. This wound a circuitous route through the estate, passing some of its failed or failing business enterprises on the way. The dog whined and grumbled a little until its master bent down stiffly and let it off its leash, whereupon it gave a gruff yelp of pleasure, lurched forward a couple of paces, and then resumed its hobbling plod, in unison with, but now a good 2 yards ahead of, its master. From time to time it glanced back to check that its master was still there, that all was well, and that nothing was going to jump out and bite them. Moving thus, they slowly rounded a long bend in the drive, the man hunched inside a long dark coat, despite the easy temperature of the evening. After a few minutes they passed on their left the entrance to the zoo that had been such a drain on the estate's limited resources. There were very few animals left in it now, a couple of goats, a chicken, and a capybara, the world's largest rodent. There was also a special guest animal in the zoo at the moment, being housed temporarily while its normal quarters in Chatsfield Zoo were being rebuilt. Desmond, the animal's name was Desmond, had only been in residence for a couple of weeks so far, but his presence had, not surprisingly, caused a bit of a stir in the village of Little Ranting. As the man and his dog passed the entrance to the zoo, they paused for a moment, and then turned and looked at it again. The low, wooden gate, which should have been secured at this time of night, was standing open. The dog whimpered, and snuffled around on the ground, which seemed to have been scuffed and churned up a little. The man hobbled up to the open gate and peered into the darkness beyond. Among the low huddle of buildings, all was darkness, except for a single dim light that glowed from the hut where Roy Harrison, Desmond's keeper from Chatsfield, was staying. Nothing untoward. No sign of movement. So why was the gate open? It probably meant nothing. Most things, the man would have told you if you had asked him, probably meant nothing. Nevertheless, he summoned his dog with a gruff syllable and limped crossly through the gate, closing it behind them. Slowly, grindingly, they made their way along the gravel path to the single source of light, Roy Harrison's temporary abode. The place seemed quiet. The man rapped sharply on the door and listened. No answer. He knocked again. Still, nothing. He opened the door. It wasn't locked, but then, there was probably no reason for it to be. As he pushed his way into the tiny, dark hallway, his nose twitched at an odd smell. Zookeepers' lodgings were exactly where you would expect to find a vast and rich range of odd smells. But not necessarily this particular sweet, cloying one. Oomph! The dog let out a very, very slight little yelp. On the right side of the hallway was a door, the source of both the light that could be seen from outside and the fragrance that could be smelt within. Still, all was quiet. Carefully the man pushed the door open. At first glance he thought that the figure slumped over the kitchen table might be dead, but after a long, drawn-out moment of silence it emitted a light, riffling snore. The dog whimpered again, and sniffed around the floor nervously. The dog always seemed oddly nervous for its size, and kept on glancing round to its master for reassurance. In fact, it was altogether an odd dog, of uncertain breed, or breeds. It was large and black, but its hair was tufty, its body scrawny and clumsy, and its manner edgy, anxious, verging on the completely neurotic. Whenever it came to a halt for a moment or so, the business of starting up again often seemed to cause it trouble, as if it had difficulty in remembering where it had left each of its legs. It looked as if something very nasty had happened to it, or was about to. The sleeping keeper continued to snore. Next to him was a collection of crumpled beer cans, a half-empty bottle of whiskey, and a couple of glasses. In the ashtray lay the butts of 3 joints, and scattered around were bits of a ripped-up cigarette packet, a packet of cigarette papers, and a piece of silver foil twisted up in the traditional manner. The source of the smell. Roy had clearly shared a big evening with somebody, and that somebody had clearly then pushed off. The visitor tried gently to shake him by the shoulder, but to no avail. He tried again, but this time the keeper slowly slid sideways and collapsed in an untidy, slobbering heap on the floor. The dog was so startled by this that it leapt wildly for cover behind the sofa. Unfortunately, the dog was larger and heavier than the sofa and knocked it backwards as he jumped over it, causing it to topple over on top of him. The dog yelped again, scrabbled briefly at the linoleum, and then leapt for cover once more behind a small coffee table, breaking it. Having run out of places to leap to, the dog cowered back in a corner, quivering with fright. Its master satisfied himself that Roy was merely in a temporary state of chemical imbalance and not in any actual danger, and, coaxing his dog with a few soothing words, left again. Together they followed the path back towards the gate and let themselves back out onto the main driveway, heading on the way they had been going, hobbling towards the main house. There were heavy scuff marks on the driveway. Desmond suddenly felt bewildered. In an instant everything he had always smelt about the world had gone all swimmy and peculiar on him. There were some lights flashing around him, but he didn't mind that. Lights weren't of any real concern to him. Blink, blink. So what? But this was most peculiar. He would have said that he was hallucinating, except that he didn't know the word, or indeed any word. He didn't even know that his name was Desmond. But, again, it wasn't the sort of thing that bothered him. A name was just a sound you heard, and didn't have that rich, heady reek of really being something. A sound didn't well up inside your head and go woomph the way a smell did. Smell was real, smell was something you could trust. At least it had been up till now. But now he felt as if the whole world were tipping backwards over his head, and this, he couldn't help feeling, was a very worrying thing for the world to do. He took a deep breath to try to steady his huge bulk. He drew billions of rich little molecules over the sensitive membranes of his nostrils. Not that rich, in fact. The smells here were mean little smells, flat, stale, and bitter. Smells with an acrid undertow of something nasty being burnt. None of the large, generous smells of hot, grassy air and day-old dung that haunted his imagination, but at least these paltry little local smells should steady him and root him on the ground. They didn't. Herfrara. Now he seemed to have 2 different and completely contradictory worlds in his head. Grarf. What was all this? Where had the horizon gone? That was it. That was why the world seemed to be tilting up above his head. Where there was usually a perfectly normal horizon, there now wasn't one. There was more world instead. A lot more. It just went on and on and on. Into a strange and hazy distance. Desmond felt big weird fears welling up. Inside him. He had a sudden instinct to charge at something, but you couldn't. Charge at a worrying uncertainty. He nearly stumbled. He drew in another deep breath. He blinked, slowly. Horror! The new bit of the world had vanished. Where was it? Where had it gone? There it was again. It unfolded itself blotchily into place and he felt as if he were tipping over again, but this time he was able to steady himself. More quickly. Stupid little lights. Blink, blink, blink. This new bit of the world. What was it? He peered forward uncertainly into it, letting his mind's nostril play over it. Those lights were beginning to distract him. He shut his eyes to let him concentrate on his exploration, but when he did, the new world vanished. Again. He wondered for a dizzying moment if there was any connection between these two things, but making logical connections between things was not really one of Desmond's strengths. He let it pass. As he opened his wrinkly little eyes again, the unearthly new world slowly unfurled itself in his mind. Once more he peered into it. It was a wilder world than the one he was used to, a world of paths and hills. The paths forked, divided, and deepened into valleys, the ridges reared into high hills. The far distance was completely broken up into massive mountain ranges and dizzying canyons shrouded in shifting mists. He was filled with apprehension. Just as making logical connections between things was not one of Desmond's strengths, neither was mountaineering. The flattest, broadest path lay straight ahead of him, but as he turned his attention to it, worrying things began to become apparent. Something nasty lay down that path. Something big and nasty. Something even bigger and nastier, Desmond ventured to think, than Desmond himself. For a moment he blinked again, and annoyingly the whole thing vanished. Once more. When it reassembled itself in his mind's nostril a second or two further on, the sense of impending disaster intensified. Was that thunder? Desmond didn't usually mind thunder, scarcely noticed lightning, but this thunder he did mind. There was no uplifting swirl of heavy air dancing, just bad, cracking explosions of blackness. Desmond began to feel very fearful. His enormous bulk began to quake and shudder, and suddenly he began to run. The strange new world shattered and vanished. He ran like a truck. He hurtled through a flurry of small, feeble lights and brought a whole ton of some kind of stuff, he didn't know what, banging down around him. It crashed noisily and flashed a bit, but Desmond plowed straight through it. He was out of there, fleeing like a locomotive, smashing through a flimsy door, maybe even a wall, it was all the same to him. He hurtled out into the night air, pounding the ground with hammer blows from his enormous feet. Things around him scattered from him. Things shouted. Distant, plaintive exclamations of alarm and despondency welled up in his wake, but Desmond didn't care. He just wanted some night air in his lungs. Even this night air, stale and acrid as it was good. It was cool and rushed over him and into him as he charged. There was hard pavement beneath his feet, then, briefly, bits of fencing around his neck, and then rough, scrubby grass beneath his pounding, churning feet. He was near the top of a low hill. A real, earthy hill, not some fearsome hallucination rearing up in his mind like the approach of death. Just a hill, surrounded by other low, sloping hills. The sky was clear of clouds, but hazy and murky. Desmond was not interested in stars. You couldn't get a good whiff off a star, but here you could scarcely even see them either. He didn't care, he was just getting up a good heavy speed going down this hill, waking up some sleepy muscles and getting them going. Brayerm. Run. Hurdle. Charge. Crash. Bang. There seemed to be more bits of fencing round his neck. Again, and suddenly his progress was rather less free than it had been, and he was all encumbered with stuff. He plowed on heavily. Suddenly he found himself in a sea of scattering creatures squealing as his huge bulk careered through them. The air was full of the sound of cries and bellows and little tinkly crashes. Bewildering odors danced around him, a surge of burning meat, heady wafts of some kind of woozy-making stuff, big stabs of viciously sweet musk. He was confused and tried to fix on things by sight. He didn't trust vision very much, it didn't tell him very much. He could just about tell when things were blinking or lurking or running around. He tried to get a fix on the hollering, scurrying shapes, and then saw a big hazy rectangle of light. That was something. He heaved himself round and charged at it. Crash. And also some nasty, rainy, itchy sensations all over his flank. He didn't like that. He stumbled as he barged into a large room and was immediately assaulted with a suffocating splurge of smell, screamy noises, and splashy lights. He charged into a huddle of screaming creatures, which roared and screeched and then went all cracked and squidgy. One of them got stuck on him and Desmond had to shake his head to dislodge it. Before him now was another large glinting rectangle, and a little way beyond it the ground shimmered with a pale blue light. Desmond lunged forward again. There was another crash, and another shower of sharp and worrying pain. He hurtled onwards and out into the open air once more. The light in the ground was a strange pool of water, with screaming things in it. He had never seen water glow like that. And then there were some more blinking lights in front of him. He didn't pay any attention to the little lights. He didn't even pay any attention to the banging noises that went with each blink. Bang bang, so what? But what did catch his attention was the sudden acrid smell and the flowers of pain that started to bloom in his body. A flower was planted in his shoulder, and another. His leg began to move. Oddly. A flower was planted in his flank, which felt very odd and worrying. Another flower was planted in his head, and gradually the whole world started to become more distant and less important. It began to roar. He felt himself tipping forward with enormous slowness, and gradually found himself enveloped in great waves of warm, glowing blueness. As the world ebbed from him, he heard a gabbling, hysterical voice making sounds that made no sense to him, but they sounded like this. Get the paramedics. Get the police. Not just Malibu, get the LAPD. Now. Tell them to get a helicopter up here. We've got dead and wounded. And tell them. I don't know how they're gonna deal with this, but tell them we've got a dead rhinoceros in the swimming pool. Chapter 10. Though it was now embarrassingly clear to Dirk that only he and not his actual quarry was aboard the flight, that he had been thrown 4,000 miles and a couple of thousand crucial pounds off course by a childishly simple ruse, he nevertheless determined to make one final check. He stationed himself right by the exit as everyone started to disembark at O'Hare Airport. He was watching so intently that he nearly missed hearing his own name being called over the aircraft's PA, directing him to go to the airline's information desk. Mr. Gently, said the woman at the desk, brightly. Yes, said Dirk warily. May I see your passport, sir? He passed it over. He stayed poised on the balls of his feet, expecting trouble. Your ticket through to Albuquerque, sir. My ticket through to Albuquerque, sir. My ticket to Albuquerque, sir. Albuquerque? Albuquerque, New Mexico, sir. Dirk looked at the proffered ticket folder as if it were a piece of trick. Rhubarb. Where did this come from? He demanded. He took it and peered at the flight details. The woman gave him a huge airline smile and a huge airline shrug. Out of this machine, I guess. Just prints those tickets out. What does it say on your computer? Just says prepaid ticket for Mr. Dirk Gently to Albuquerque, New Mexico, to be collected. Were you not expecting to go to Albuquerque today? Sir? I was expecting to end up somewhere I didn't expect. I just wasn't expecting it to be Albuquerque, that's all. Sounds like it's an excellent destination for you, Mr. Gently. Enjoy your flight. He did. He sat and ruminated quietly to himself over the events of the last couple of days, arranging them in his mind not in such a way that they made any kind of sense yet, but in suggestive little arrays. A meteor here, half a cat. There, the electronic threads of invisible dollars and unexpected airline tickets that connected them. Before touching down in Chicago, his self-confidence had been in tatters, but now he felt a thrilling tingle of excitement. There was something or someone out there that he had engaged with. Something that he uniquely had found and that he was being drawn towards. The fact that he still had no idea who or what it was no longer troubled him. It was there, he had found it, and it had found him. He had felt its pulse. Its face and its name would emerge in their proper times. At Albuquerque Airport he stood silently for a while under the high-painted beams, surrounded by the dark, staring eyes of the drunk-driving lawyers, peering from their billboards. He breathed deeply. He felt calm, he felt good. He felt able to meet with the wild, thrashing improbabilities that lie in atoms' depth beneath the dull surface of the narrated world, and to speak their language. He walked unhurriedly to the long escalators, and sailed slowly downwards like an invisible king. His man was waiting for him. He could tell him immediately, another still point in the scurrying airport. He was a large, fat, sweaty man with an ill-fitting black suit and a face like a badly laid table. He stood a few feet back from the foot of the escalator, gazing up it with an inert but complicated expression. It was as well that Dirk had been ready to spot him because the sign he held, which read D. Gentry, was one he might otherwise easily have missed. Dirk introduced himself. The man said his name was Joe and that he would go and get the car. And that, rather anticlimactically, Dirk felt, was that. The car drew up at the curbside, a slightly elderly, black stretch Cadillac, gleaming dully in the airport lighting. Dirk regarded it with satisfaction, climbed into it, and settled into the back seat with a small grunt of pleasure. The client said you'd like it, said Joe distantly from his driving coupe as he quietly rolled the thing forward and out onto the airport exit road. Dirk looked around him at the scuffed and threadbare velveteen blue upholstery, and the tinted plastic film peeling from the windows. The TV, when Dirk tried it, was tuned to nothing but noise, and the asthmatic air conditioning wheezed out a musty wind that was in no way preferable to the warm evening desert air through which they were moving. The client was dead right. The client, said Dirk, as the great rattling thing cruised out onto the dimly lit freeway through the city. Who exactly is the client? An Australian gentleman, he sounded like, said Joe. His voice was rather high and whiny. Australian, said Dirk, in surprise. Yes sir, Australian. Like you. Dirk frowned. I'm from England, he said. But Australian, right? Why Australian, exactly? Australian accent. Well, not really. Well, where's that place? What place? Asked Dirk. New Zealand, said Joe. Australia's in New Zealand, right? Well, not precisely, but I can see what you're, well, I was going to say. I can see what you're getting at, but I'm not sure I can. What part of New Zealand you from, then? Well, more sort of England, in fact. Is that in New Zealand? Only up to a point, said Dirk. The car headed north on the freeway in the direction of Santa Fe. Moonlight lay magically on the high desert. The evening air was crisp. You been to Santa Fe before? Joe nasaled. No, said Dirk. He had abandoned trying to engage him in any kind of intelligible conversation and began to wonder if he had been deliberately chosen for his shortcomings in this area. Dirk was trying hard to stay sunk in thought, but Joe kept yanking him back to the surface. Beautiful place, said Joe. Beautiful. If it doesn't get ruined by all the Californians moving in. Californication they call it. Her. You know what they call it? Californication, hazarded Dirk. Fond to say, said Joe. All the Hollywood types moving in from California. Ruining it. Especially since the earthquake. You heard about the earthquake? Well, I did, as a matter of fact, said Dirk. It was on the news. Rather a lot. Yeah, it was a big earthquake. And now all the Californians are moving out here instead. To Santa Fe. Ruining it. Californians. You know what they call it? Dirk could feel the whole conversation wheeling round and coming at him. Again. He tried to deflect it. Have you always lived in Santa Fe, then? He said feebly. Oh yeah, said Joe. Well, nearly always. Over a year now. Feels like always. So where did you live before? California, said Joe. Moved out after my sister was hit in a drive-by shooting. You have drive-by shootings in New Zealand? No, said Dirk. Not in New Zealand so far as I know. Nor even yet in London, which is where I live. Look, I'm sorry about your sister. Yeah. Standing on a street corner down on Melrose, couple of guys drive by in a Mercedes, one of those new ones, you know, with the double glazing. And pow, they blew her away, 500 SEL, I think it was. Midnight blue. Real smart. They must have jacked it. You have carjacking back in Old England? Carjacking? People walk up to you, steal your car. No, but thanks for asking. We have people who clean your windscreen. Against your will, but, Joe barked with contempt. The thing is, explained Dirk, in London you could certainly walk up to someone and steal their car, but you wouldn't be able to drive it away. Some kind of fancy device? No, just traffic, said Dirk. But, your sister, he asked nervously. Was she okay? Okay, shouted Joe. You shoot someone with a Kalashnikov in there. Okay, you're gonna want your money back. Her. Dirk tried to make sympathetic noises, but they wouldn't form properly in his throat. The car was slowing down, so he lowered the peeling window to look at the desert night. A passing road sign flared briefly in the car's headlights. Stop the car, shouted Dirk suddenly. He leaned out of the car window, straining to look back as the car gradually wallowed to a halt. In the distance the dim shape of a road sign was silhouetted in the moonlight. Can you reverse back down the road? Said Dirk urgently. It's a freeway, protested Joe. Yes, said Dirk. There's no one behind us. The road's empty. Only a few hundred yards. Grumbling to himself, Joe put the big barge into reverse, and slowly they weaved their way back down the freeway. This is what they do in New Zealand, isn't it? He whined. What? Drive backwards. No, said Dirk. But I know what you're thinking of. Just like us British. They do drive on the other side of the road. Suppose it's safer that way, said Joe, if everyone's driving backwards. Yes, said Dirk. Much safer. He leaped out of the car as soon as it drew to a halt. Highlighted in the pool of the car's lights, 5,000 miles from Dirk's ramshackle office in Clerkenwell, was a square yellow road sign that said, in large letters, gusty winds, and, in smaller letters underneath it, may exist. The moon hung high in the sky above it. Joe, shouted Dirk to the driver. Who put this here? What, said Joe. This sign, said Dirk. You mean this sign, said Joe. Yes, shouted Dirk. Gusty winds may exist. Well, I suppose, said Joe, the State Highway Authority. What, said Dirk, bewildered again. The State Highway Authority, said Joe, a bit flummoxed. UCM. All over. Gusty winds may exist, said Dirk. You mean this is just a regular road sign? Well, yeah, said Joe. Just means it's a bit windy here. You know, wind comes across the desert. Can blow you around a bit. Especially in one of these. Dirk blinked. He suddenly felt rather foolish. He had been imagining, little wildly, that someone had specially painted the name of a bisected cat on a signpost on a New Mexican road especially for his benefit. This was absurd. The cat in question had obviously been named after a perfectly commonplace American road sign. Paranoia, he reminded himself, was one of the normal byproducts of jet lag and whiskey. Chastened, he walked back toward the car. Then he paused and thought for a second. He went up to Joe's window and peered in. Joe, he said. You slowed the car down just as we were approaching the sign. Was that deliberately so that I would see it? He hoped it wasn't just the whiskey and the jet lag talking. Oh no, said Joe. I was slowing down for the rhinoceros. Chapter 11. Probably the jet lag, Dirk said. I thought for a moment you said a rhinoceros. Yeah, said Joe, disgustedly. Got held up by it earlier. As it was leaving the airport. Dirk tried to think this through before he said anything that might expose him to ridicule. Presumably there must be a local football team or rock band called the Rhinoceroses. Must be. Coming from the airport? Driving to Santa Fe? He was going to have to ask. What exact type of rhinoceros are we discussing here, he said. Dunno. I'm not as good at breeds of rhinoceros, said Joe, as I am at accents. If it was an accent, I could tell you what exact type it was, but since it's a rhinoceros I can only tell you that it's one of the big gray type, you know, with the horn. From Irkutsk or one of those kind of places. You know. Portugal or somewhere. You mean Africa? Could be Africa. And you say it's up there on the road ahead of us? Yup. Then let's get after it, said Dirk. Quickly. He climbed back into the car, and Joe eased it out onto the highway once more. Dirk hunched himself up at the front of the passenger compartment and peered over Joe's shoulder as they sped on through the desert. In a few minutes the shape of a large truck loomed up ahead in the Cadillac's headlights. It was a green low-loader with a large, slatted crate roped down onto it. So, you're pretty interested in rhinoceroses, then, said Joe. Conversationally. Not especially, said Dirk. Not till I read my horoscope this morning. That right? Don't believe in them myself. You know what mine said this morning? It said that I should think long and hard about my personal and financial prospects. Pretty much what it said yesterday. Course, that's pretty much what I do every day, just driving around. So I suppose that means something, then. What did yours say? That I would meet a 3-ton rhinoceros called Desmond. I guess you can see a different bunch of stars from New Zealand, said Joe. It's a replacement. That's what I heard, volunteered Joe. A replacement? Yup. A replacement for what? Previous rhinoceros. Well, I suppose it would hardly be a replacement for a light bulb, said Dirk. Tell me, what happened to the, previous rhinoceros? Died. What a tragedy. Where? At the zoo? At a party. A party? Yup. Dirk sucked his lip thoughtfully. There was a principle he liked to adhere to when he remembered, which was never to ask a question unless he was fairly certain he would like the answer. He sucked his other lip. I think I'll go and take a look myself, he said, and climbed out of the car. The large, dark green truck was pulled onto the side of the road. The sides of the truck were about 4 feet high, and a heavy tarpaulin was roped down over an enormous crate. The driver was leaning against the door of the cab, smoking a cigarette. He clearly thought that being in charge of a 3-ton rhinoceros meant that no one would argue with him about this, but he was wrong. The most astonishing amount of abuse was being hurled at him by the drivers negotiating their way one by one past his truck. Bastards, muttered the driver to himself as Dirk wandered up to him in a nonchalant kind of way and lit a companionable cigarette himself. He was trying to give it up, but usually kept a pack in his pocket for tactical purposes. You know what I hate, said Dirk to the truck driver. Those signs in cabs that say thank you for not smoking. I don't mind if they say please don't smoke, or even just a straightforward no smoking. But I hate those prim thank you for not smoking signs. Make you want to light up immediately and say, no need to thank me, I wasn't going to not smoke. The driver laughed. Taking this old bugger far? Asked Dirk, with the air of one seasoned rhinoceros delivery driver comparing notes with another. He gave the truck an appraising glance. Just out to Malibu, said the driver. Way up Topanga Canyon. Dirk gave a knowing cluck as if to say, don't talk to me about Topanga Canyon. I once had to take a whole herd of wildebeest to Cardiff in a minibus. You want trouble? That was trouble. He sucked deeply on his cigarette. Must have been some party, he remarked. Party, said the driver. I've always found that a rhinoceros makes a pretty poor kind of party. Guest, said Dirk. Try it if you must, but brace yourself. It was Dirk's view that asking direct questions made people wary. It was more effective to talk complete nonsense and let people correct him. What do you mean, party, said the driver. The party the other rhinoceros was attending, said Dirk, tapping the side of his nose, when it died. Attending, said the driver with a frown. I wouldn't say that it was actually attending the party. Dirk raised an encouraging eyebrow. It charged down out of the hills, smashed through the perimeter fence, crashed through the plate glass windows into the house, took a couple of turns around the main room injuring about 17 people, hurtled back out into the garden where somebody shot it, whereupon it toppled slowly into a swimming pool full of mostly naked screenwriters, taking half a hundredweight of avocado dip and some kind of Polynesian fruit melange with it. Dirk took a moment or two to digest this information. Then, whose house was this, he said. Just some movie people. Apparently they'd had Bruce Willis round only the previous week. Now this seems a bit rough on the old rhino as well, said Dirk. And now here's another one. The end.